Listen here, children. Gather close now. Close as the chains that bound our people, tight as the fear that gripped hearts in them dark quarters. I's gonna tell you about a woman whose name the Mississippi River still whispers when the moon hangs low and heavy. They called her Margaret do Afogamento, Margaret of the Drowning, and Lord have mercy. Her story ain't for the faint-hearted. Down there in the deep south, where the cotton fields stretched white as far as the eye could see, and the auction blocks ran red with Mama's tears, there lived a woman who looked death in the face 600 times. 600 times, child. She got thrown in the murky waters, tied and weighted like a sack of sin, only to be pulled back gasping, lungs burning with river mud and rage. The overseer thought he could break her. The master thought he owned her body and soul, but they didn't know, couldn't know that every dive made her stronger. Every plunge baptized her in the fury of the ancestors. This here's the testimony of Margaret, the woman who turned the drowning pool into a weapon, who made the Mississippi her accomplice. This is memory the plantation owners tried to bury, but suffering souls don't stay silent. They echo, they rise, they haunt. So lean in close now, for in them slave quarters where the old ones gathered and the spirituals rose soft as smoke, they still tell this tale. They still speak her name with reverence and wonder. This is her story, and it lives forever in the echoes of the slave quarters. Now listen here, child. Every story got a beginning, and Margaret started in blood and prayer, just like so many of our people's tales. It was round 1810, down in Georgia, where the red clay earth drinks deep and remembers everything. Every drop of sweat, every splash of tears, every stain of suffering that ever soaked into it. In them days of deep sorrow, when slavery's grip choked the South like kudzu on an oak tree, there was a plantation called Thornwood, and it was there Margaret's mama labored under a burning sun so cruel it could skin a soul. Her mama, folks called her Amma, which means Saturday born in the old tongue from the Gold Coast. She was a woman of iron, strong-backed and fierce, even when the chains cut into her wrists. Amma had crossed that terrible water, that middle passage where so many of our kin got swallowed by the deep. Their bodies fed to sharks while the ship captains counted coins. She survived what many couldn't, came to these cursed shores with her spirit still intact, though her body bore the brand mark on her shoulder, that devil's signature burned into flesh. The old ones warned us, the ocean remembers every scream, every prayer thrown into the salt waves. And Amma, she carried the memories in her bones. That Georgia plantation ground was a end-of-nowhere kind of place, where the cotton fields stretched so far, you couldn't see hope on the horizon. The big house sat up on the hill like a white tomb, columns tall and proud, built on our people's backs while we lived down in the dark quarters, in cabins that leaked rain and let in winter wind through the cracks. Massa Jenkins owned the place then. A hard man, cruel-hearted, but not the devil himself. Not yet. That devil was coming, though. Oh yes, he was on his way. Amma was heavy with child that spring, her belly swollen like the river after hard rain. She worked the fields till her water broke, 'cause ain't no massa gonna let a woman rest just for bringing life into this world of bondage. The other women, Sister Ruth, old Minda, young Keisha, they gathered round when her time came, there in the suffering heat of the quarters on a night when the moon hung red as blood. They boiled water, tore rags, whispered prayers in tongues the white folk couldn't understand. Folks swear on their lives they heard drums that night, soft like distant thunder, though no drum was allowed on the plantation. The ancestors was watching, you see, they always watching. "Push, sister, push," old Minda urged, her hands wise from delivering dozens of babies into this cruel world. "Call on the old ones, call on the spirits," Amma cried out, not in English, but in her mama tongue, calling on gods whose names got stolen but never forgotten. And when that baby finally slipped into the world, slick with birth blood and screaming like she already knew what kind of life awaited her, the women gasped. Even in the dim light of the tallow candle, they could see she was marked. Not with iron like her mama, but with something deeper. Her eyes, Lord of Glory, her eyes held an old soul, ancient and knowing. like she'd lived 1,000 lives before this one. "This child gonna be special," old Minda whispered, wrapping the baby in a rough blanket. "I seen it in the signs. This one gonna carry heavy spirits." They named her Margaret after the old mistress who'd shown Amma one small kindness years back, a cup of water on a killing heat day. But in secret, in the quiet of the quarters at night, Amma called her by her true name, the one whispered by the ancestors, Adiz, daughter of the king. For even in chains, we was royalty. Never forget that. Margaret's daddy was a man called Solomon, field hand with shoulders broad from years of toil, hands scarred from cotton bolls and the whip. He loved Amma fierce, though they wasn't allowed no proper marriage. On the plantation, love was a dangerous thing, a weakness masses could exploit. Solomon held his baby girl that first night, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "She gonna be strong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gonna survive this mess and a half we born into." But even as he spoke them hopeful words, trouble was brewing like a storm on the horizon. That very week, Massa Jenkins took sick. Some said it was the fever, others whispered it was a curse from a root doctor he'd wronged. Whatever the cause, he died screaming within days, and the plantation fell into chaos. His widow, Mrs. Jenkins, couldn't manage the place alone. She needed a man, needed someone to take control, and that's when he arrived. Harlan Thorpe rode up to Thornwood on a black horse dressed in fine clothes that couldn't hide the rot in his soul. He was a younger man, maybe 30 years, with pale eyes cold as winter frost, and a smile that never reached beyond his teeth. He'd made his fortune in the slave trade, buying and selling human flesh from Charleston to New Orleans, growing fat on our people's misery. Now he'd come to buy Thornwood, to expand his empire of suffering. The day he walked through the quarters inspecting his new property, and make no mistake, we was property to him, no different than the mules or the cotton gin. The air itself seemed to grow heavy. Dogs stopped barking, birds went quiet, even the wind held its breath. He stopped in front of Amma, who stood holding baby Margaret, her head bowed like all enslaved women learned to do when white men came near. But Thorpe, he noticed her anyway. How could he not? Amma was beautiful, even in her exhaustion, even with her hands calloused and her dress nothing but rags. "This one," he said to the overseer, a mean dog of a man named Pike. "She got spirit. I can see it." Pike nodded. "Yes, sir, Massa Thorpe. That's Amma. Good worker. Just had herself a baby girl." Thorpe's eyes. Lord Jesus, them eyes. They slid down to Margaret, bundled against her mama's chest. For just a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Not kindness, never that. But interest, dark interest. "A girl child," he murmured. Well, well, she'll grow strong, I reckon. Plenty of years ahead for work and other uses." Amma's blood ran cold. She clutched Margaret tighter and the baby started to cry, as if she could feel the evil in that man's gaze. Solomon, standing nearby, felt rage rise like fire in his chest, but he swallowed it down. A black man showing anger to a white massa was a death sentence, so he stood still as stone, his hands clenching till the nails cut his palms. Thorpe moved on, satisfied with his inspection, but the damage was done. The seed was planted that day, the seed of terror that would grow and grow till it choked the life out of that plantation. That night, in the safety of the quarters, Amma held Margaret close and sang her a lullaby in the old tongue, a song about the homeland across the water, about freedom and wide open skies. But even as she sang, tears rolled down her face, because she knew, deep in her mother's heart she knew, the devil had come to Thornwood and he'd set his sights on her baby girl. Outside, the Georgia night pressed down heavy, and somewhere in the distance, a hound howled long and mournful, like it was mourning for all the suffering yet to come. Now you see, people, Margaret grew up fast in them fields, the way all slave children had to. Ain't no such thing as childhood when you born in bondage. By the time she was 7 years old, her hands already knew the cruel bite of cotton bolls, them sharp pods that cut fingers raw and left them bleeding by day's end. The burning sun beat down without mercy, skin in heat that made grown men faint and children cry out for water. They wasn't allowed to drink till the overseer said so. But Margaret, she was a powerful, strong child, just like old Minda had prophesied. She carried her mama's blood and her daddy's broad shoulders, and something else too. Something the others noticed but didn't speak on much. She had eyes that could see beyond the visible world, into the realm where spirits walked. The old folks said she was touched by the ancestors, blessed and cursed all at once. In them days, life on Thornwood Plantation was pure confusion mixed with endless suffering. Massa Thorpe proved himself to be the devil folks suspected, working the enslaved from sunup to sundown, then beyond, till stars came out and the moon climbed high. He brought in more overseers, each one meaner than the last, and they walked the rows with whips for nothing, cracking leather on backs for the smallest infractions. A glance held too long, a song sung too loud, a pause to wipe sweat from the brow. "Pick faster, you lazy dogs," the driver would shout. And yes, even we had drivers. Black men forced to police their own people, carrying the weight of survival and guilt all mixed together. Massa wants 200 pounds per person today. Y'all fall short. Everybody gets the post. The whipping post stood in the center of the quarters like a cursed monument. Dark wood stained with old blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard the rain tried. Margaret seen many folks tied there, men, women, even young ones barely past childhood. Their backs split open like ripe fruit, screaming prayers to Jesus, while the overseers laughed and counted lashes. But in the quarters at night, when the white folks slept and the darkness gave us a small piece of privacy, that's when the real living happened. That's when folks became human again. Old Uncle Josiah, he told stories round the fire. Tales of Anansi, the spider trickster from the homeland, who outwitted the powerful with cleverness and guile. "See, children," he'd say, his voice a scratchy whisper, smoke rising from his pipe. "Anansi teach us that the strong ain't always the smartest. A small creature with a sharp mind can bring down a lion. Remember that." Margaret, she listened with her whole heart, soaking up them lessons like parched earth drinks rain. She learned the hidden meanings in the spirituals, how wade in the water wasn't just about baptism, but about escaping through rivers so the hounds couldn't track your scent. How swing low, sweet chariot spoke of the Underground Railroad, them brave souls who guided freedom seekers north. How steal away to Jesus meant meeting in secret at the hush harbor deep in the woods, where folks could worship without white supervision. She made friends among the quarters. There was little Samuel, a boy her age with a gap-toothed smile who could imitate any bird call so perfect you'd swear a cardinal sat on his shoulder. There was Dinah, a girl fierce and quick-tempered, who swore she'd run away someday and never look back. And there was Esther, quiet and wise beyond her years, who taught Margaret which roots could heal and which could harm. "This here's horse mint," Esther would whisper, showing Margaret plants in the thin woods behind the quarters. "Good for fever. But this one," she pointed to a dark purple flower, "this one'll make a man sick as a dog. Root doctors use it to cross enemies if you know the way." Margaret learned. Oh, she learned everything she could, knowing somehow that knowledge was a kind of freedom, even if her body stayed chained. But suffering was never far away. When Margaret was 9, she fell in love, innocent child love, sweet as honeysuckle, with a boy named Isaiah. He was 12, tall and graceful, with hands that could carve wood into beautiful shapes. He made her a little bird once, smooth and perfect, and she kept it hidden under her pallet like treasure. They'd meet by the creek when they could steal moments, talking about dreams that seemed impossible. "When I'm free," Isaiah would say, skipping stones across the water, "I'm gonna have me a farm, grow my own food, answer to nobody." "When I'm free," Margaret would echo, "I'm gonna find my people, all the ones who got sold away, bring them back together." But one day, Isaiah made a mistake. He was caught looking at Mrs. Thorpe. Just a glance, nothing disrespectful, but in a slave's life, intention didn't matter, only perception. The overseer, Pike, grabbed him by the neck. You think you can eye white women, boy? Pike snarled, dragging Isaiah toward the whipping post while folks watched in horror. I'll teach you your place. They stripped Isaiah's shirt and tied his wrists high. Margaret stood with the other children, forced to watch, tears streaming down her face as the whip fell. 1, 2, 10, 20. Isaiah's back opened up, blood running down like rain on a window. He screamed at first, then went silent, biting through his lip to keep from giving them the satisfaction. Let this be a lesson, Pike shouted to the gathered enslaved. Y'all are property. Animals, know your place. Margaret's hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She wanted to run to Isaiah, to throw herself between him and that terrible whip. But her mama held her back, gripping her shoulder fierce. Don't, Amma whispered urgently. You move, they'll whip you too, or worse. Just witness, remember, but don't move. That night, Margaret and the other women tended to Isaiah's wounds, washing them with salt water that made him whimper, applying poultices of herbs and fat. He survived, but he was never quite the same. The light went out of his eyes, the dreams died on his tongue, and Margaret? She learned a bitter lesson that day. Love in bondage is a luxury slaves can't afford. Every attachment is a weakness the masses can exploit. Every person you care about is a hostage against your rebellion. But she also learned something else. Something old Minda whispered to her later. Child, your heart gonna break 1,000 times in this life. But each break make you stronger, like a bone that heals. It's harder where it was broke. You remember that. As the years passed, Margaret became a woman in body, though in her heart she still carried that wild child spirit. She was 14 when Amma got sold away, sold downriver to pay Thorpe's gambling debts. Margaret stood at the quarters, watching her mama loaded onto a wagon, chains around her wrists, headed to the auction block in Savannah. A daisy, Amma called out, using her secret name one last time. You survive, you hear me? You survive no matter what. The ancestors watch over you. Solomon broke that day. He took to drinking what little liquor he could steal, became a man past saving, a lost soul wandering the plantation like a haint. Within a year, he tried to run. They caught him at the county line, brought him back tied to a horse. Massa Thorpe made an example of him. They didn't kill him quick, no, that would have been mercy. They sold him to a chain gang down in Mississippi, working men to death in the swamps. Margaret never saw her daddy again. She was alone now, orphaned by slavery if not by death. And that's when Thorpe's eyes fell on her proper for the first time. Margaret, now 15, tall and strong, beautiful like her mama had been. One evening, as the sun bled red over the cotton fields and the bell rang to signal end of work, Overseer Pike appeared at her side. Massa wants to see you, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach drop. Up at the big house, tonight. You clean yourself up and come after supper bell. Margaret's heart went heavy, chest got tight. She looked around at the other women, and she saw the truth in their pitiful souls. They knew what this summons meant. Sister Ruth touched her arm gently. Be strong, child, she whispered. It ain't your fault. None of this is your fault. But as the darkness fell and Margaret walked that muddy road from the quarters to the big house, she felt like she was walking toward her own whipping post. The night carried heavy spirits, and somewhere deep in the woods an owl cried out. Old folks say that's a death omen. She climbed the back steps, the ones slaves used, and entered the house through the kitchen. The house girl, an older woman named Belle, gave her a look full of suffering and knowing. He's waiting in his study, Belle said quietly. Lord have mercy on your soul, child. Margaret walked down the hall, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud as African drums in her ears. When she reached the study door, she paused, hand on the knob, praying to every god she could name. Jesus, the spirits, the ancestors, anyone who might listen. Then she opened the door. Harlan Thorpe sat behind a massive desk, lamplight casting shadows on his pale face. He looked up at her and smiled. And Lord Jesus, that smile was the most terrifying thing Margaret ever seen. Close the door, girl. he said softly. "Come here. We're gonna get to know each other real well." And the darkness swallowed her whole. "Now listen here, child. What I'm about to tell you ain't easy to speak on, and it sure ain't easy to hear. But this is the testimony, the raw truth of what our people endured. And if we don't tell it, who will? If we let these stories die, then the suffering was for nothing. So steady yourself, 'cause this is where Margaret's real torment began, where the devil showed his true face. That night in Thorpe's study, time moved strange, fast and slow all at once, like when you drowning, and every second stretches into eternity. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey, of leather-bound books Margaret couldn't read, of power that corrupted everything it touched. Harlan Thorpe sat there behind his desk looking at her like she was a piece of meat at market, something to be appraised and used. "You know why you're here, girl?" he asked, his voice smooth as snake oil. Margaret kept her eyes on the floor, heart beating like a runaway's flight through the swamp. "No, massa," she whispered, though she knew. Lord of Glory, she knew. "Look at me when I speak to you," Thorpe commanded. And when she raised her eyes, she saw hunger there. Not for food, but for dominion, for the power to break another human being under his will. "You're a woman now. 15, I'm told. Strong, healthy. Good breeding stock." The words hit her like a whip crack. Breeding stock. That's all she was to him, all any of them were. Just animals to be bred and worked and sold. "You understand what your position is here?" Thorpe continued, standing up from his desk, moving around it slow and deliberate. "You belong to me. Your body, your time, your very breath. It's all mine. I can do with you as I please, and there ain't no law, no God, no man who'll stop me. You comprehend that?" "Yes, sir," Margaret managed, her voice barely a breath. "Good," he said, and there was that terrible smile again. "Because from now on, you're gonna serve me in special ways. When I call for you, you come. When I touch you, you don't resist, you understand? Resistance only makes things harder for you. And trust me, girl, I can make your life a living hell if you test me." Margaret stood there, froze like a deer that hears the hunter's step, praying to Jesus, to the ancestors, to anyone. But the silence of death filled that room and no answer came. That first night, Thorpe didn't go all the way. Not yet. He was playing a game, like a cat with a mouse, enjoying the fear in her eyes. He made her stand there while he circled her, touching her shoulders, her back, her face, his fingers cold and invasive. He breathed in her scent like she was some exotic flower he'd purchased. Every touch made her skin crawl, made her want to run screaming into the night. "You're gonna be my favorite," he whispered close to her ear, his breath reeking of bourbon. "I can tell. You got that fire in you, that spirit I enjoy breaking. Your mama had it too before I sold her off. But you're gonna be special." When he finally dismissed her, Margaret ran back to the quarters like hell itself was chasing her. She burst into the cabin she shared with Sister Ruth and 3 other women, and she collapsed on the hard ground, shaken all over, trembling bad. Sister Ruth held her while she cried, rocking her like a baby. "I know, child, I know. We all been through it. Every woman here knows that particular suffering. How do you bear it?" Margaret sobbed. "How do you wake up every day knowing—" "'Cause we got to," Ruth said simply, her voice heavy-hearted but steady. "We survive 'cause our people need us to survive. We endure cause to give up is to let them win completely. You understand? Your body might be in chains, but your spirit, that's yours. Don't never let them take that." But over the following weeks and months, Thorpe made it his mission to try and break that spirit. He called for Margaret regular, sometimes once a week, sometimes every night for days straight. The pattern was irregular, designed to keep her in constant anxiety, never knowing when the summons would come. Pike would appear at the fields or the quarters, and Margaret would see that evil-hearted look on his face, and she'd know. "Massa wants you," Pike would say with a smirk, enjoying his role in her torment. "Clean yourself up and get to the big house." And Margaret would go, 'cause what choice did she have? Run? Where would she run to? The patrols hunted runaways with dogs that could track a scent for miles. Folks who got caught faced horrors worse than what Thorpe did. Public whippings, brandings, mutilations, sometimes death. Resist? Fight back? That was a quick way to the whipping post or worse. Sold down to the deep south where the work was killin', and life expectancy measured in years you could count on one hand. So she endured. She learned to leave her body while he violated it, to send her mind somewhere else. Back to childhood, when her mama sang lullabies, when her daddy held her safe, when freedom seemed like something that might exist somewhere beyond the cotton fields. The old ones taught her this trick, this survival skill born of necessity. Go to the river in your mind, old Minda told her. Go to Africa, to the homeland. Let your body be here, but your soul fly free. But Thorpe, he wasn't satisfied with just the physical violation. No, he wanted to break her psychologically too. He'd whisper cruel things while he used her, telling her how worthless she was, how she should be grateful for his attention, how no one cared what happened to a slave girl. He'd remind her that he owned her mama, her daddy, everyone she loved, and he could destroy them all with a word. You think anyone will believe you if you complain? He'd laugh, full of fury at his own power. You think any court would take a nigger's word over mine? You're property, girl, less than property. You're a thing I use and discard when I'm done. The worst part wasn't just the violation itself. It was how he made her complicit. He'd make her serve him dinner before, playing the role of the attentive master. He'd ask her questions about her day, pretending to care, creating this twisted parody of intimacy. Then he'd take what he wanted, and afterward, he'd give her small gifts. A ribbon, an extra ration of food, a night off from field work. These kindnesses were poison, designed to confuse her, to make her question whether she should be grateful, to create a sick dependency. Margaret learned to hate those gifts more than the abuse itself. She'd throw the ribbons in the fire, give the food to children in the quarters who needed it more. But the nights off? She couldn't refuse those, 'cause it meant rest for her body that was worked to exhaustion every day. The other enslaved folks knew what was happening, of course. Everybody knew. Some of the older women tried to counsel her, sharing their own stories of survival. Some of the men looked at her with pity and rage they couldn't express. And some, Lord have mercy, some blamed her, saying she must have done something to catch Massa's eye, must have been given eyes or acting uppity. That judgment from her own people cut deeper than Thorpe's violations in some ways. Only a few stood firm beside her. Sister Ruth, who'd survived similar horrors under the previous master. Esther, who brought her special teas, some for preventing pregnancy, some for easing the pain, some that might have been meant for darker purposes but neither of them spoke on directly. And Isaiah, her childhood love, who avoided her now not out of disgust but out of his own broken heart, unable to bear witnessing what was being done to her. Months turned into a year. Margaret's body changed. She grew harder, leaner, her eyes developing that 1,000-yard stare common among the deeply traumatized. She stopped singing the spirituals she once loved, stopped telling stories to the children, became a shadow of herself, just surviving, just barely living. But deep inside, beneath all that hurt, something else was growing too. Not resignation, but rage. Cold, patient rage that waited like a coiled snake, watching for its moment. She began to notice things about Thorpe, his patterns, his weaknesses, his fears. She learned that he was terrified of being seen as weak, that he drank more when certain business deals went bad, that he had nightmares about slave revolts. She also learned that she wasn't the only one he abused. There were others, younger girls he was grooming, older women he'd tired of and cast aside. The big house was a den of horrors, with Mrs. Thorpe locked away in her own misery, knowing full well what her husband did, but too weak or too complicit to stop it. Then came the night that changed everything. Thorpe called for Margaret as usual, but this time he was drunk. Not just tipsy, but stumbling, slurring drunk. When she arrived at his study, he was ranting about some business deal gone wrong, about slaves who didn't appreciate their blessings, about how he was the master of his domain and everyone would bow to him. "Come here," he commanded. But when Margaret approached, he grabbed her roughly, more violent than usual. She gasped in pain, and for the first time she fought back. Not consciously, but instinctively, pushing at his chest to create space. The slap came swift and hard, knocking her to the floor. Her lips split, blood filling her mouth with the taste of copper and rage. "You dare resist me?" Thorpe roared, standing over her like the devil incarnate. "I'll show you what happens to defiant bitches." He dragged her outside, across the yard, and Margaret's heart went cold as she realized where they were going. Toward the river, the Mississippi that flowed dark and deep beside the plantation. Other slaves had been punished there before, but never her. Not until now. At the riverbank, Thorpe called for Pike and 2 other overseers. They appeared quickly, probably been waiting nearby, anticipating this very scenario. "Tie her," Thorpe ordered, and they bound her wrists with rough rope, attaching weights to her ankles. "Please, massa," Margaret begged, truly frightened now. "Please, I'm sorry, I won't never—" "Shut your mouth," Thorpe screamed. "You need to learn, you all need to learn." And then they threw her in the water. The cold hit first, shocking the air from her lungs. Then the weights pulled her down into the murky depths where the moonlight couldn't reach. Margaret thrashed, her lungs burning, her mind screaming, certain she was gonna die. This was it. Drowned in the Mississippi like so many runaways before her, like so many rebellious slaves who'd met their end in these dark waters. But just before the blackness took her completely, they pulled her up. She gasped, choking on river water and air all mixed together, coughing till her ribs ached. "You understand now?" Thorpe asked, his face twisted with sick pleasure. "This is what happens when you resist. I can kill you anytime I want, but I won't. I'll just keep teaching you this lesson until you learn." They threw her in again. And again and again. That night, Margaret was drowned and resurrected 6 times. Each time she saw the face of death. Each time they pulled her back. And with each plunge, something inside her changed. The fear transformed into something harder, colder, more dangerous. When they finally untied her and let her crawl back to the quarters, shaken and waterlogged and traumatized, she made a vow in her heart, a promise to the ancestors, to her mama, to herself. Someday she would make Harlan Thorpe drown in these same waters. Someday he would know the terror he'd inflicted. Someday the Mississippi would take him and never give him back. But that day wasn't today. Today, she just had to survive. Tomorrow she'd plan. Gather round, chillun, 'cause what I'm about to tell you is the hardest part of Margaret's story to speak on. The moment when innocence dies and a woman is born from the ashes of a girl's destroyed spirit. This ain't no tale for the faint-hearted, but it's the truth, and truth demands to be told, no matter how it cuts. After that night of drownings, Margaret thought she understood the depths of Thorpe's cruelty. But she was wrong. The river torture was just the beginning, just his way of establishing dominance, of showing her that resistance had consequences more terrible than submission. In them days of deep sorrow, a slave woman's body wasn't her own. It belonged to the massa, to be used however he saw fit, and the law gave her no protection, no recourse, no dignity. For 2 weeks after the drownings, Thorpe left her alone. This mercy, if you could call it that, wasn't kindness. No, it was strategy. He was letting her wounds heal, letting her body recover so she'd be useful again. During those 2 weeks, Margaret worked the cotton fields from sunup to sundown, her muscles aching, her lungs still burning from the river water she'd swallowed, her mind circling like a trapped bird around one question: when would he call for her again? The answer came on a humid August night, when the air hung so thick you could barely breathe, when the quarters buzzed with mosquitoes and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Pike appeared at sunset, just as the enslaved were returning from the fields, bone-tired and hungry. "Margaret," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that made every woman in the quarters look away in shared shame and relief. Shame that it was happening, relief that this time it wasn't them. "Massa wants you. Tonight, his private chambers." Margaret's heart went heavy, chest got tight. Sister Ruth squeezed her hand once, quick and secret. "Be strong, child. she whispered. Your body is just meat and bone, but your soul, that's eternal. They can't touch that unless you let them. But as Margaret walked that muddy road from the quarters to the big house, those words felt hollow as a dead tree. How do you protect your soul when someone's violating your body? How do you keep your spirit intact when everything sacred about you is being destroyed? The big house loomed against the darkening sky like a tomb, all white columns and false righteousness. Margaret entered through the back door, past the kitchen where Belle, the house cook, was cleaning up from dinner. Belle was maybe 50 years old, her hair gone gray, her back bent from decades of service. She'd survived 3 different masters, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd seen every kind of human evil. He's upstairs, Belle said quietly, not meeting Margaret's gaze. In his bedroom. Says you're to spend the night. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Not just an hour or 2 in his study, but the whole night. Sweet Jesus, this was different. This was worse. She climbed the back stairs, each step feeling like a walk to the gallows. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit with oil lamps, casting shadows that danced like demons on the wallpaper. She could hear Mrs. Thorpe in her own chambers, humming some sad tune, pretending not to know what was about to happen just rooms away. When Margaret reached Thorpe's bedroom door, she paused, hand trembling on the doorknob. Behind that door was the devil himself, waiting to consume her. She thought about running, just bolting down the stairs and out into the night. Consequences be damned. But where would she go? The patrols would hunt her down with dogs. They'd bring her back and make an example of her that would terrify every enslaved soul on the plantation. So she opened the door. Thorpe was waiting, sitting on the edge of his massive 4-poster bed, already half undressed. The room smelled of cologne and sweat and something darker. The scent of power corrupted beyond redemption. Lamplight played across his pale skin, and Margaret noticed for the first time how much older he looked up close. Lines of dissipation etched around his eyes and mouth from years of whiskey and cruelty. "Close the door," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Lock it." Margaret's hands shook as she turned the lock, hearing the click that sealed her fate. "Come here," Thorpe ordered, patting the bed beside him. "Sit." She moved like a woman in a nightmare, her feet carrying her forward even as her mind screamed to flee. When she sat on the edge of the bed, she could feel the expensive mattress beneath her. So different from the hard pallet she slept on in the quarters, from the rough blankets and dirt floors that were all enslaved people were allowed. Thorpe reached out and touched her face, his fingers cold despite the heat. "You're beautiful," he said, almost conversational. "Do you know that? In your own way, quite striking. Your mama was beautiful too. I enjoyed her before I sold her off." The casual cruelty of those words, "enjoyed her like she was a meal or a cigar," made bile rise in Margaret's throat. But she swallowed it down, keeping her face as blank as she could manage. "You're going to be good to me tonight," Thorpe continued, his hand moving from her face to her neck, her shoulder lower. "You're going to do exactly what I say, when I say it. If you resist, if you fight, if you displease me in any way, well, you remember the river, don't you?" "Yes, sir," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't hear you." "Yes, sir, massa," she said louder, and she hated herself for the submission in her tone, hated that survival required her to speak words that choked her. What happened next, I won't describe in full detail. Some horrors are too sacred to the suffering to be laid bare completely. But know this, Thorpe took what wasn't his to take. He violated Margaret in every way a man can violate a woman, treating her not as a human being but as an object for his pleasure, a thing to be used and degraded. She cried silently, tears running down her face while he grunted and thrust, thinking only of his own gratification. Margaret tried to do what old Minda had taught her, to send her mind elsewhere, to fly free while her body remained captive. She thought of her mama's lullabies, of her daddy's strong arms, of the homeland across the water that she'd never seen but carried in her blood. She thought of the spirituals sung in secret at the hush harbor, of freedom songs that promised a better world beyond this vale of tears. but the pain kept pulling her back to the present, to the physical reality of what was being done to her. And the worst part, Lord of Glory, the worst part, was when Thorpe forced her to participate, to touch him, to pretend she wanted this. "Say you like it," he commanded, and when she hesitated, he grabbed her throat. "Say it." I like it, massa," she choked out, dying a little inside with each word. Afterward, he fell asleep almost immediately, snoring like a hog while Margaret lay beside him, her body aching, her spirit shattered. She stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the lamplight, and wondered if this was how every night would be from now on. This endless cycle of violation and survival, of being broken down and somehow finding the strength to get up the next morning. She thought about the razor she'd seen on Thorpe's dresser, gleaming sharp in the lamplight. It would be so easy to reach for it, to end his life while he slept vulnerable beside her. But then what? They'd hang her from the nearest tree, make a spectacle of her death as a warning to every other slave who might think about rebellion. And her death would accomplish nothing. There'd just be another Harlan Thorpe to take his place, another master to inflict the same horrors. No. If she was going to strike back, it had to be smart. It had to be planned. It had to be in a way that she might actually survive. As the night wore on and Thorpe's snoring filled the room, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The girl she'd been, the one who'd played by the creek with Isaiah, who'd believed in fairy tales and justice, that girl died in that bed. In her place, a woman was born, a woman who understood that survival sometimes meant becoming harder than the oppression trying to crush you. Near dawn, Thorpe woke and used her again, this time rough and quick, barely acknowledging her as a person. When he finished, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Go on, get out. Be back at the fields by first light, or Pike will know the reason why." Margaret dressed quickly, her movements mechanical, and fled the room. She made it down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the pre-dawn darkness before she finally broke down. Behind the smokehouse, hidden from view, she collapsed and vomited, until there was nothing left in her stomach but bile and shame. Sister Ruth found her there as the sun began to rise, wrapped her in her arms and rocked her while she sobbed. "I know, baby. I know," Ruth murmured, her voice full of a grief that spanned generations. "We all know. Every woman here knows this particular hell. But you survived. You're still here. That counts for something." "I feel dead inside," Margaret whispered. "Like everything that made me me is just gone." "It ain't gone," Ruth insisted, gripping her shoulders and making her look up. "It's just buried, hidden away where he can't reach it. But it's still there, child. Your mama's strength, your daddy's courage, the ancestors' wisdom. It's all still inside you. Don't let him take that. Don't give him that power." Margaret wanted to believe her, but as she walked to the fields that morning, her body aching from violation and lack of sleep, she wasn't sure she could. How many more nights like this would she have to endure? How many more times could she be broken before she couldn't be put back together? The answer came 2 months later when Margaret missed her monthly bleeding. At first, she tried to deny it, but Sister Ruth knew the signs. "Child," Ruth said gently, placing a hand on Margaret's still flat belly. "You're with child. Massa's child." The words hit Margaret like a whip crack. Pregnant, carrying Thorpe's baby. The ultimate violation, her body being used to create new property for him, new slaves to continue the cycle of suffering. That night, Margaret stood by the river, the same Mississippi that had nearly drowned her, and she made a choice. She could end it. End the pregnancy with the herbs Esther could provide, end her own life by walking into those dark waters and never coming back. Or she could live. She could survive. She could bear this child and somehow, impossibly, find a way to give it a better life than hers. She chose life. Not because she wanted to, but because something in her, some stubborn, unbreakable core, refused to let Harlan Thorpe have the final victory. He could violate her body, could force her to bear his children, could own her legally and physically. But he couldn't make her give up. That was the one power she still possessed. As the months passed and her belly swelled, Thorpe's attitude toward her changed. He was almost pleased, proud even, like she was a mare who'd proven fertile, increasing his property value. He gave her lighter work in the fields, extra rations, a new dress. These kindnesses made Margaret want to scream. The other enslaved had mixed reactions. Some women offered support and advice about childbirth and mothering in bondage. Some men looked at her with pity or disgust, unable to separate her from her circumstances. And some, the worst ones, whispered that she must have wanted it, must have seduced Massa to get those better rations. Only Sister Ruth, Esther, and a few others understood the truth. Margaret was a survivor of war, and her body bore the battlefield. When her time came on a cold February night, the same women who delivered Margaret 16 years earlier gathered to bring this new life into the world. Margaret labored for hours, sweating and crying, and cursing Thorpe's name with every contraction. And when the baby finally emerged, slick and screaming, the midwife held her up. "It's a girl," old Minda announced. Margaret looked at her daughter, this tiny, perfect being with light brown skin that showed her mixed heritage, with Thorpe's features mixed with her own, and felt a complicated rush of emotions. Love, yes, fierce, protective love that surprised her with its intensity, but also rage that this child would be born into bondage, sorrow that she couldn't protect her, fear of what the future held. "What you gonna name her?" Sister Ruth asked gently. Margaret thought of her mama sold away and lost. She thought of the homeland she'd never seen. She thought of freedom, that distant star that seemed unreachable. "Ayodele," she said finally, using a name from the old tongue. "It means joy has come home, because even in this hell, she's joy. She's mine." Thorpe came to see the baby the next day, looking down at his daughter with satisfaction. "She'll fetch a good price in 15 years or so," he said casually. "Maybe sooner if she develops like you did." Those words, the implication that he'd violate his own daughter the way he'd violated Margaret, ignited something in her. Right then, holding Ayodele in her arms, Margaret made a silent vow. This child would know freedom. Somehow, someway, Margaret would make sure of it. Even if it cost her everything. Even if it cost her life. In them days, people, being a mama in bondage was the sweetest blessing and the cruelest curse all wrapped up together. Margaret learned this truth in her bones from the moment she first held Ayodele against her chest, felt that tiny heartbeat synchronize with her own, and understood that she'd just given the world another hostage against her rebellion. Every slave mother knew this weight. Loving your child fierce as a mama bear, while knowing the master could snatch them away at any moment, sell them downriver before they could even walk, use them as leverage to break your spirit completely. Now listen here, child. Margaret threw herself into motherhood like it was salvation itself. For the first few months after Ayodele's birth, she was allowed to keep the baby close, nursing her in the fields when she cried, carrying her on her back in a sling made from torn cloth while she picked cotton under that burning sun. The other enslaved women formed a protective circle around them both, sharing the burden of childcare the way our people always did, knowing that every child born in the quarters belonged to all of us, not just to their blood mama. Sister Ruth taught Margaret how to wrap Ayodele tight so the baby wouldn't cry and draw unwanted attention. Old Minda showed her which herbs could ease colic and fever, which roots could protect against evil spirits and bad conjure. Esther, wise beyond her years, whispered darker knowledge. Which plants could end a pregnancy if Margaret ever found herself in that position again, which powders could make a man sick without killing him, which rituals could call on the ancestors for protection. "This baby's special," old Minda said one night, examining Ayodele's tiny hands by firelight in the quarters. "See how her lifeline runs deep? She gonna live long, that one. Gonna see things change, maybe even see freedom." Margaret wanted to believe it, wanted to clutch that prophecy to her chest like a talisman. But she'd learned not to hope too hard, not to dream too big. Hope was dangerous for enslaved people. It made the reality of bondage that much more unbearable. Iodel grew despite the harsh conditions, a testament to Margaret's fierce determination to keep her alive. By 6 months, she was a chubby baby with bright eyes that seemed to take in everything. With her mama's strong spirit and, Lord have mercy, her daddy's pale complexion that marked her as Thorpe's property in ways that went beyond legal documents. The other light-skinned children on the plantation bore similar markers of violation, walking proof of what masters did to enslaved women. Margaret sang to Iodele every night, the old spirituals and work songs that carried hidden meanings. Wade in the water became a lullaby. Swing low, sweet chariot, a promise of freedom someday. She told her stories of Anansi the spider, of how the small and clever could outwit the powerful. She whispered tales of the homeland across the water, of queens and warriors, of a time before chains. "You remember, baby girl," Margaret would murmur, rocking Iodel in the dim quarters while rain leaked through the roof. "You come from royalty. Your grandmama was a queen in her own land before the white devils stole her. You got that blood in you. Don't never forget." But even as Margaret built this cocoon of love and protection around her daughter, Thorpe's shadow loomed large. He visited the quarters sometimes, inspecting his stock, and he'd always stop to look at Iodel with a proprietary satisfaction that made Margaret's stomach turn. "She's growing well," he'd observe, like he was commenting on a calf or a foal. "Good strong bones. She'll be valuable." Valuable. That's all their children were to masters. Future workers, future breeding stock, future profit. Margaret would hold Iodel tighter after these visits, whispering promises against her soft baby hair. "You ain't gonna be enslaved forever. Somehow, some way, I'm gonna get you free." The other women in the quarters understood Margaret's particular burden. Many of them had borne their master's children, watched them grow up neither fully enslaved nor fully acknowledged, existing in a painful limbo. Some of these light-skinned children got sold away young to avoid the embarrassment of their presence. Others grew up serving in the big house caught between two worlds, trusted by neither. Life on Thornwood Plantation continued its brutal rhythm, sunup to sundown in the fields, backs bent over cotton rows, fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, overseers cracking whips for the smallest infractions. Margaret worked harder than ever now that she had a mouth to feed, knowing that if her productivity slipped, there'd be consequences. Pike watched her with particular malice, waiting for any excuse to punish her. But Margaret had learned to be careful, to keep her head down and her hands moving, to avoid giving them any reason to separate her from Iodel. She'd seen it happen to other mothers, babies torn from breast and sold away while their mamas screamed and begged. She'd witnessed the aftermath, the hollow-eyed women who moved through their days like haints, their spirits broken beyond repair. At night, in the quarters, the enslaved community came alive in small ways. There was courting and gossip, secrets whispered and alliances formed. Margaret made friends among the other young mothers. Dinah, who'd been her childhood companion, now had a son named Jacob. They'd sit together while their children played, sharing tips on survival, on how to stretch meager rations, on which plants in the woods were safe to forage. But Margaret also made enemies. Some folks resented the slightly better treatment Thorpe gave her on account of Iodel being his daughter. They didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that Margaret hadn't chosen this, that being the master's favorite was a curse, not a blessing. Jealousy and judgment ran through the quarters, just like it ran through any community, made worse by the pressure cooker of bondage that turned people against each other. One woman, a bitter soul named Cora, confronted Margaret by the water pump one evening. "You think you special?" she hissed, loud enough for others to hear. "You think carrying Massa's baby makes you better than us?" Margaret, exhausted from a day in the fields with Iodel strapped to her back, felt rage rise like fire in her chest, but she swallowed it down, knowing that fighting among themselves was exactly what the masters wanted. "I don't think nothing of the sort," she said quietly, meeting Cora's eyes. "What happened to me could happen to any of us. Probably will happen to most of us. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want it. I survive it the best I can. That's all any of us can do." The words hung in the humid evening air, and something shifted in Cora's face. A flicker of recognition, of shared pain. She didn't apologize, but she nodded once and walked away, and that was as close to understanding as they'd get. As Ayodele approached her first birthday, Margaret noticed Thorpe's attention shifting back to her. The brief respite of pregnancy and early motherhood was ending. He started summoning her to the big house again, sometimes with Ayodele, sometimes making her leave the baby with Sister Ruth. Each time, Margaret's heart went heavy, chest got tight, knowing what awaited her. The violations resumed, perhaps worse now because Margaret had something to lose beyond her own body and spirit. She had a daughter whose safety depended on her compliance. Thorpe knew this, used it like a weapon. "You want to keep that baby close?" he'd ask after forcing himself on her. "Then you better make me happy. You better not resist. Otherwise, I might decide to sell her off, send her down to Mississippi, where they work pickaninnies to death in the rice fields." The threats worked. Margaret submitted because what choice did she have? Fight back and lose Ayodele? Run and risk both their lives? So she endured, and she hated herself for enduring. And the cycle continued. But one spring evening when Ayodele was 14 months old, everything changed. The baby fell sick, high fever, couldn't keep down milk, crying inconsolable. Margaret tried everything, cool cloths, herbal teas, prayers whispered over her burning little body. Nothing worked. "Please," Margaret begged old Minda, tears streaming down her face. "Please, there must be something, some root, some conjure, something." Minda's face was grave. "This beyond herbs, child. This is serious sick, she need a real doctor." But enslaved children didn't get doctors. They got home remedies and prayers, and if those didn't work, they died. Margaret had watched it happen to other children in the quarters, seen little graves dug behind the cabins, heard mothers wailing their grief to uncaring stars. That night, Margaret did something desperate. She wrapped Ayodele in a blanket and walked straight to the big house, ignoring the rules that said slaves didn't approach after dark without permission. She pounded on the back door until Belle answered, eyes wide with shock. "Child, what you doing? You know Massa don't like—" "My baby's dying," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She's his daughter too. He got to help her. He got to get a doctor." Belle tried to stop her, but Margaret pushed past, climbed the stairs, and burst into Thorpe's study where he sat with his ledger books and whiskey. He looked up, startled and angry. "What the hell? Please, Massa." Margaret fell to her knees, holding Ayodele out like an offering. "Please, she's dying. Your daughter's dying. Get a doctor. I'll do anything. Anything you want. Just save her." Thorpe stared at them both for a long moment, and Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes. He could let the baby die. After all, there could always be others. Or he could show mercy, use this moment to bind Margaret even tighter to him. "Put her on the couch," he said finally. He sent for the white doctor who arrived drunk but functional. After examining Ayodele, he prescribed medicine, expensive medicine that Thorpe paid for without complaint. Over the next week, Ayodele slowly recovered, the fever breaking, her appetite returning. But the price Margaret paid was higher than any medicine. Thorpe made sure she understood that she owed him now, that he'd saved Ayodele's life, and that debt would be collected in flesh and obedience. "You remember this," he told her, his hand gripping her throat while he violated her the night after Ayodele's fever broke. "I own you both, life and death. I gave your daughter life, and I can take it away just as easy. You belong to me completely now." And Margaret, holding her sleeping daughter later that night in the quarters, knew he was right. She was trapped more securely than any chains could hold her. Her love for Ayodele had become the strongest bondage of all. But even in this darkness, a small spark of resistance still glowed in her heart. Someday, she promised herself. Someday, she'd find a way. She'd get Ayodele free. And then she'd make Thorpe pay for every violation, every threat, every moment of suffering. The Mississippi River whispered in the distance, patient and eternal, waiting for the debt to be paid in full. Now folks swear on their lives, when they speak of what happened next, that the ancestors themselves wept that day. The sky turned dark as mourning cloth, though no storm clouds gathered, and the birds went silent, like they was paying respect to suffering too great for even nature to witness. I tell you now, child, this is where Margaret's true trial began, where the drowning pool became her crucible, where water became both her enemy and her teacher. Iodel survived that fever, grew into a walking child with bright eyes and quick laughter that could pierce through the darkness of the quarters like lamplight. By 2 years old, she was talking up a storm, repeating the spirituals Margaret sang, trying to help in the fields by picking cotton bolls and putting them in her little basket. The other enslaved folks doted on her, this light-skinned child who represented both violation and hope, trauma and resilience. But Thorpe's mercy in saving Iodel had come with strings attached, heavy as iron chains. He expected gratitude, expected Margaret to be even more submissive, more available, more compliant. And for a while she was. What else could she do? Every time she looked at her daughter's face, she remembered that Thorpe held the power of life and death over them both. The other women in the quarters saw the change in Margaret, how she'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, how the fire that once burned in her eyes seemed banked low. Sister Ruth worried, tried to counsel her. "Child, you can't let him break you completely," Ruth said one evening as they sat outside the cabins watching the children play in the dust. "I know you trying to protect Iodel, but if you lose yourself, what kind of mama will you be?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched Iodel chase lightning bugs in the twilight, heard her daughter's pure laughter, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her chest. "What would you have me do?" she finally asked, her voice bitter as gall. "Fight back and watch him sell her? Resist and end up dead, leaving her alone in this hell? I ain't got no good choices, Sister Ruth. I just got different kinds of suffering." Ruth sighed, recognizing the truth in those words. "I know, baby. I know." But the breaking point came anyway, unexpected as summer lightning. It was a Sunday, the one day enslaved folks got a few hours of rest after morning chores. Margaret was sitting outside her cabin, braiding Iodel's hair into tight cornrows the way her own mama had done for her. The little girl squirmed and giggled, making the task harder, but filling Margaret's heart with a joy so sharp it almost hurt. Across the yard, Thorpe appeared with Mrs. Thorpe, returning from church service in town. They were arguing. You could hear their voices rising even from a distance. The missus had found out about another slave woman Thorpe had violated, and she was demanding he sell the woman away rather than keep adding to the shame of mixed-race children on the plantation. "You think I don't know what you do?" Mrs. Thorpe's voice carried, shrill with impotent rage. "You think I'm blind to your depravity? That woman and that one, and especially that Margaret, you flaunt your bastards in front of me like it's nothing." Margaret's hands stilled in Iodel's hair. She felt every enslaved person in the quarters go quiet, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Thorpe's response was cold. "They're my property. I'll do with them as I please. You do well to remember your place, woman." "My place." The missus's voice cracked with decades of suppressed humiliation. "My place is being humiliated while you rut with slaves like an animal? Look at that child." She pointed directly at Iodele. "She's got your eyes, your nose. Everyone can see it. It's shameful." Something in Margaret snapped. Maybe it was hearing her daughter discussed like she was evidence of a crime rather than a precious child. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years of violation and silence. Maybe it was the ancestors whispering in her ear that enough was enough. She stood up, trembling all over, rage so thick nobody spoke, and she walked toward Thorpe and his wife, Iodel clutching her hand. "Don't you dare," Margaret said, her voice low but carrying like thunder. "Don't you dare talk about my daughter like she's something shameful. She's innocent. She didn't ask to be born into this mess. And you," she looked at Mrs. Thorpe with eyes blazing, "you got some nerve blaming us for what he does. We don't got no choice. You think any of us wanted this?" The silence that fell was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Every enslaved person in the quarters froze, knowing that Margaret had just crossed a line no slave crossed and lived. You didn't talk back to white folks. You didn't show anger. You didn't speak truth to power. Thorpe's face went red, then white, then red again. His hands clenched into fists. What did you just say to my wife? Margaret knew she'd made a terrible mistake, but the words kept pouring out like water from a broken dam. I said she got no right to blame us for what you force on us. We're victims too. Can't she see that? Can't nobody see? The blow came fast, Thorpe's fist connecting with her jaw and sending her sprawling in the dirt. Iodel screamed. Sister Ruth rushed forward to grab the child, pulling her away from the violence. You ungrateful bitch! Thorpe snarled, standing over Margaret. After everything I've done for you, after I saved your daughter's life, this is how you repay me? Margaret tasted blood, her mouth filling with copper and rage. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the violations began, she didn't lower her eyes in submission. She stared right at him, defiant as she'd ever been. You ain't done nothing for me, she spat blood on the ground. You violated me, used me, treated me worse than an animal, and now you want gratitude? Go to hell. Pike and the other overseers had gathered, sensing trouble. Thorpe gestured to them, his face twisted with fury. Tie her, he ordered. This one needs to learn respect, needs to learn her place once and for all. They dragged Margaret to her feet, bound her wrists with rough rope that cut into her skin. Iodel was crying, reaching for her mama, but Sister Ruth held her back, whispering prayers and comfort. Mama! Mama! The child wailed, and the sound tore at Margaret's heart worse than any whip. They dragged her toward the river, the Mississippi that flowed dark and patient beside the plantation. Margaret knew what was coming. She'd seen it done to others, heard the stories whispered in the quarters, the water torture, the forced drownings that broke spirits without leaving marks that would damage property value. At the riverbank, they attached iron weights to her ankles, heavy enough to pull her under, but not so heavy she couldn't be retrieved. Thorpe stood watching, arms crossed, his face a mask of cold fury. You think you can speak to white folks however you please? He said. You think you got rights, dignity? You're nothing, property, a thing I own. And I'm going to teach you that lesson over and over until it sticks. Margaret looked at him, then past him to where Sister Ruth held Iodel. She locked eyes with her daughter one last time, trying to memorize that precious face, knowing she might not survive this. Do what you want to me, she said to Thorpe. But remember, someday you gonna answer for all of this. If not in this life, then in the next. Throw her in, Thorpe ordered. They lifted Margaret and hurled her into the Mississippi like she was nothing but a sack of refuse. The cold water enveloped her, shocking the breath from her lungs. The weights pulled her down into the murky depths where sunlight couldn't penetrate, where the bottom was all mud and lost things. Margaret thrashed, lungs burning with river mud and the need for air that couldn't come. Her vision darkened at the edges. She thought of Iodele, of her mama sold away, of her daddy worked to death. She thought of all the enslaved souls who died in these waters, runaways drowned by slave catchers, punished men and women who couldn't swim against the current, children thrown in as examples. The ancestors was watching. She could feel them. Could see their faces in the murky water. Her mama's mama, her daddy's daddy, all the way back to the homeland. They whispered to her in languages she didn't speak, but understood in her bones. Survive, endure, live. Just as the blackness closed in completely, they pulled her up. Margaret broke the surface, gasping, choking, vomiting river water and bile. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, her chest heaving with the effort to breathe. But she barely had time to draw 2 breaths before they threw her back in. Again, the cold embrace of water. Again, the weights pulling her toward death. Again, the ancestors whispering, live. They pulled her up, threw her back, pulled her up, threw her back. 6 times that day, Margaret drowned and was reborn. Each time, she saw the face of death a little clearer. Each time, the temptation to just let go, to stop fighting, to sink into the darkness grew stronger. But each time, something in her refused to surrender. Some stubborn core of resistance that Thorpe couldn't reach no matter how many times he tried to kill her. On the sixth drowning, something changed. As Margaret sank into the depths, she stopped fighting. Instead, she opened her eyes underwater, looked into the murky darkness, and made a promise to the river itself. "I will survive this," she swore silently. "And one day, these same waters that are drowning me will drown him. I swear it on my ancestors, on my daughter, on every soul that suffered in these waters." When they pulled her up that final time, Margaret wasn't the same woman who'd gone in. Her eyes held something new, not just rage, but cold calculation, purpose. A promise made to powers older than slavery itself. They untied her and let her crawl back to the quarters, coughing up river water, her body shaking violently. Sister Ruth and the others gathered around her, wrapped her in blankets, made her drink warm broth. Iadel clung to her, crying, "Mama, Mama." "I'm here, baby," Margaret whispered, her voice raw. "Mama's here." But she wasn't. Not really. The woman who'd been Margaret, the one who still hoped, still believed in mercy, still thought submission might buy safety. That woman had drowned in the Mississippi. What crawled out was something harder, colder, more dangerous. That night, as she lay on her pallet with Iodele curled against her chest, Margaret stared at the ceiling and began to plan. Not wildly, not desperately, but carefully. She had time. She could be patient. She would survive however many more drownings Thorpe inflicted. She would endure whatever violations came. But in the end, the debt would be paid. In the end, the river would have its due. And Harlan Thorpe would discover too late that you can drown a woman's body, but you can't drown her will to survive, her capacity for vengeance, her promise to the ancestors. The Mississippi whispered agreement in the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting for the day when justice would finally come. Old folks say that suffering can do one of two things to a soul. It can break you down to dust, or it can forge you into something unbreakable. Margaret became the second kind, though the forging took years and cost her pieces of herself she'd never get back. Listen here now as I tell you about the years of drowning, the endless cycle of water and resurrection that gave her the name she'd carry forever. Margaret do Affogamento. After that first punishment by the river, Thorpe discovered he'd found the perfect torture, one that satisfied his cruelty without damaging his property's market value. Whipping left scars that buyers at auction noticed and complained about. Branding marked slaves permanently. But drowning left nothing but the memory of terror, and you couldn't see memories when inspecting merchandise. So the drownings became regular as the seasons. Any small defiance, a glance held too long, a task done too slow, a word spoken with insufficient deference, and Margaret found herself dragged to the Mississippi. Sometimes it was 6 plunges, sometimes 10. Once it was 15 when she dared ask for better food for Ayodele. The overseers kept count like it was a game, making bets on how many times she could go under before she stopped struggling. "That's 23 total," Pike announced one day, checking his ledger like he was tallying cotton bales. "She's tougher than most. Usually they break by a dozen. But Margaret didn't break. She learned instead. Learned to control her breathing, to slow her heartbeat, to accept the water rather than fight it. Learned which prayers to whisper before they threw her in, which ancestors to call on for strength. The old root doctor, a wizened man named Uncle Josiah who practiced conjure in secret, taught her a ritual. "'Fore they take you to that river," he whispered one night behind the quarters, "you chew on this calamus root. It'd help your lungs hold air longer. And you speak this word 3 times in your mind. Yamoja. She's the ocean mother from the old country, the one who protects those who suffer in water. She hear you, child. She remember." Margaret did as instructed, and whether it was the root or the goddess or just her own fierce will to survive, she endured. The drownings that should have killed her became something else. A dark baptism that transformed her piece by piece into something beyond human endurance. Years passed in this cruel rhythm. Ayodele grew from toddler to child, watching her mama disappear to the river and return soaked and shaking, learning too young that the world was a place of casual violence and arbitrary cruelty. By the time the girl was 5, She'd witnessed dozens of her mother's drownings, and something in her bright eyes had gone hard. "Why they do that to you, Mama?" she asked one night, curled against Margaret's still damp body. "'Cause they can, baby," Margaret answered, her voice hoarse from coughing up river water. "'Cause in this world might makes right and we ain't got no might. But someday..." She trailed off, not wanting to fill her daughter's head with promises she might not be able to keep. During these years, Margaret bore 2 more children, both boys, both carrying Thorpe's features mixed with her own. The first she named Samuel, after little Samuel from her childhood who'd been sold away years before. The second she named Moses, after the biblical deliverer, hoping the name might carry some protective power. She loved her sons fierce, but differently than she loved Ayodele. With her daughter, there was a shared understanding of female suffering and bondage. With the boys, there was the desperate hope that maybe, being male and light-skinned, they might have slightly better chances in this hell. Maybe they wouldn't be violated the way women were. Maybe they could learn a trade, work in the big house, have lives marginally less brutal than field work. But Thorpe had different plans. When Samuel was just 3 years old, barely walking good, still calling for his mama at night, Thorpe announced he was selling the boy. Cotton prices had dropped, gambling debts had accumulated, and a trader from Natchez was offering good money for fancy children, light-skinned ones who could be trained as house servants or worse. "No," Margaret said when she heard, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. "No, please, massa, not my baby, he's too young, please." But her begging meant nothing. On a cold November morning, she watched them dress Samuel in clean clothes, watched the trader examine his teeth and muscles like he was livestock, watched money change hands. The boy cried for her, reaching out his little arms, calling "Mama, Mama," in a voice that would haunt her nightmares forever. Sister Ruth and the other women had to physically hold Margaret back as the wagon rolled away, her son's cries fading into the distance. She fought like a wildcat, screaming, cursing Thorpe's name, calling down every curse and conjure she knew. "You gonna pay for this?" she shrieked, her voice raw. "You hear me? The ancestors gonna make you pay. The spirit's gonna..." Pike struck her across the face, silencing her. "Shut your mouth or we'll throw you in the river for a month straight." But the damage was done. Something in Margaret shattered that day. And when they dragged her to the Mississippi for punishment, 50 plunges, they said, for her outburst, she went almost willingly. Because what was drowning compared to watching your child stolen? What was physical death compared to the death of hope? Under the water in the cold darkness, Margaret spoke to Yamoja, to the ancestors, to any power that might be listening. "Take me or give me strength," she prayed. "But don't leave me in between. Don't leave me alive but broken." The answer came not in words but in a vision. Deep underwater, lungs burning, vision darkening, she saw her mama's face. Amma, sold away years ago, likely dead by now. Her mama smiled and touched her cheek with a ghostly hand. "Survive," the vision whispered. "For Ayodele, for Moses, for all the children yet unborn. Survive and remember. Survive and testify. Survive and avenge." When they pulled Margaret up from that 50th drowning, the overseers were shocked she was still breathing. Pike himself looked shaken. "This one ain't natural," he muttered to the other men. "Ain't no woman should survive that many plunges. It's like she's protected or something." Word spread through the quarters that night. Margaret do Afogamento, Margaret of the drowning, who couldn't be killed by water no matter how hard they tried. Some folks started to believe she had special powers, that she'd made a deal with river spirits that she was unkillable. Others just saw her as a warning. This is what resistance costs. This is what happens when you defy. But Margaret knew the truth. She wasn't protected. She was just too stubborn to die, too filled with rage and grief to give Thorpe the satisfaction of breaking her completely. Every drowning hardened her more, made her colder, more calculating. She kept count in her mind. 50 drownings this time, maybe 60 total so far. The number climbed, 100, 200, each one a marker of her suffering, each one a debt Thorpe was accumulating that someday somehow would come due. Moses grew, a quiet boy who clung to his mama and sister. Iodel, now 8 years old, helped care for her little brother, singing him the same songs Margaret had sung to her. The girl had her mama's strength and her daddy's intelligence, and Margaret began to teach her everything: how to read the stars for direction, which moss grew on the north side of trees, where the safe houses on the Underground Railroad might be located. "Why you teaching me this, Mama?" Iodel asked one night. "'Cause someday you might need it," Margaret answered. "Someday you might get a chance to run, and when that chance comes, you take it. You don't look back. You run, and you don't stop till you're free." But freedom seemed farther away than ever. The drownings continued. 300, 400 times Margaret was thrown into the Mississippi. Her body grew lean and hard, all softness beaten away by labor and torture. Her eyes developed that distant look common to folks who'd seen too much suffering. Young women in the quarters started calling her Mama Margaret, seeking her counsel, asking for strength. "How you do it?" they'd ask. "How you keep going?" "'Cause giving up is what they want," she'd answer, her voice flat with accumulated pain. "And I won't give them that satisfaction. I'll die when I'm ready, on my terms, not theirs." Then came the day Moses turned 4, and Thorpe announced he too would be sold. Same trader, same destination, same heartbreak. This time Margaret didn't scream or fight. She stood silent as stone while they took her boy, while Moses cried for her, while the wagon rolled away carrying another piece of her heart. She didn't cry until she was alone that night, and then she cried so hard Sister Ruth worried she might die from grief alone. 500 drownings. That's where the count stood when Moses was sold. 500 times dead and brought back. 500 resurrections, each one hardening her heart a little more. Iodel was all she had left now. Her daughter, 11 years old, already working in the fields, already catching Thorpe's eye in ways that made Margaret's blood run cold. She knew what was coming, knew that soon Thorpe would turn his attention to Iodel the way he'd turned it on her all those years ago. And Margaret knew she'd kill him before she let that happen, even if it meant her own death, even if it meant losing everything. The Mississippi whispered in agreement, patient and dark, waiting for the blood it had been promised. The count continued. 550, 600, 600 drownings. And Margaret Dua Fogamento still lived, still breathed, still plotted her revenge in the cold darkness of the quarters at night. The ancestors watched and waited. Yamoja held her close under the waters, and somewhere in the depths of Margaret's soul, a plan began to form. In them days, child, the auction block stood in every major city of the South like altars to the god of commerce and cruelty. Natchez, Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, each had their own markets where human flesh was bought and sold, where families were torn asunder without mercy, where the only thing that mattered was profit. And in the spring of 1830, when Iodel turned 12 years old, Margaret faced the auction block once more, this time for her last remaining child. Now listen here, people, and understand the full horror of what I'm telling you. Margaret had survived 600 drownings by this point, 600 times thrown into the Mississippi, 600 times pulled back from death's door. Her body bore no scars from the water torture, but her soul was marked deep with grief and rage. She'd lost 2 sons to the slave trade, watched them carted away crying for their mama. But Iodel had been spared. Iodel had stayed, until Thorpe's debts grew too large to ignore. The whispers started in the quarters first, the way bad news always did. Pike mentioned to one of the house servants that Massa Thorpe was in deep financial trouble. Gambling losses, failed cotton crops, money owed to dangerous men in New Orleans. And when white men got desperate for cash, enslaved folk paid the price. "He's gonna have to sell some of us," Sister Ruth said quietly one evening, her voice heavy with dread. Question is who? Margaret knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. Thorpe had been watching Iodel with increasing interest, but he'd also been calculating. A 12-year-old girl, light-skinned, healthy, intelligent. She'd fetch a premium price at auction, especially in the fancy trade where lighter-complexioned enslaved people were sold for specialized purposes, often as house servants or worse. The confirmation came on a Sunday morning. Thorpe summoned Margaret to the big house, and she went with her heart already sinking, knowing what was coming. "I'm selling the girl," he said without preamble, not even looking up from his ledger. "Trader's coming next week. She'll go to Natchez, probably end up in some rich man's house in New Orleans. It's good money. I need good money." Margaret stood frozen, the words hitting her like physical blows. "Please," she whispered, all pride stripped away. "Please, massa, not Ayodele. She's all I got left. Please, I'll work double. I'll do anything. Just don't take my baby." Thorpe finally looked up, and there was something almost like curiosity in his cold eyes. "You'd do anything?" "Anything," Margaret confirmed, knowing she was walking into a trap but unable to stop herself. "Interesting," Thorpe mused, "because I've been thinking. You've survived an extraordinary amount of discipline. 600 drownings, give or take. That's remarkable, almost supernatural." He stood and walked around his desk. "Tell me, Margaret, do you think you could survive 1,000? The question hung in the air like a noose. Margaret understood immediately. He was offering a devil's bargain. More drownings in exchange for keeping Ayodele. More torture, more near-death experiences, more resurrections from the Mississippi's dark waters. "If I survive 1,000, Margaret said slowly. "You keep Ayodele here, you don't sell her." "Oh, I'll keep her," Thorpe smiled, and the evil in that smile made Margaret's stomach turn. "Though I make no promises about what I'll do with her once she's older. But yes, survive 1,000 total drownings, and I won't sell her to the traders." Margaret wanted to kill him right there, wanted to grab the letter opener on his desk and plunge it into his throat, watch him bleed out on his expensive carpet. But that would mean certain death for her, and likely for Ayodele too. So she swallowed her rage and nodded. "I'll do it." "Excellent," Thorpe said. "We'll start tomorrow." But the next morning, before the drownings could begin, the trader arrived early, a hard-faced man named Garrett who specialized in fancy merchandise. He took one look at Ayodele, and his eyes lit up with the gleam of profit. "She's perfect," Garrett said, circling Ayodele like a vulture. "How old?" 12, Thorpe answered. "Light-skinned, pretty features, healthy. I can get 1,500 for her in New Orleans, maybe 2,000 if I market her right." He grabbed Ayodele's face, turning it side to side, examining her like livestock. "Open your mouth, girl. Let me see your teeth." Ayodele, terrified, looked to her mother. Margaret stood rigid, every muscle in her body screaming to attack this man, to protect her daughter. But she couldn't move, couldn't act. The price of resistance was too high. "Good teeth," Garrett confirmed again. "Can she read?" "No," Thorpe lied, though Margaret had secretly taught Ayodele her letters. Reading was dangerous knowledge for enslaved people, illegal in most states, punishable by whipping or worse. "That's fine. Better even. The buyers I have in mind prefer ignorance." Garrett pulled out a money pouch. "I can pay you now. Take her today. I've got a coffle leaving for Natchez this afternoon." "Wait," Thorpe said, glancing at Margaret's face. "We had discussed alternative arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Garrett asked suspiciously. "You trying to back out of a sale?" And that's when Margaret realized with dawning horror that Thorpe's promise had been a lie. He'd never intended to keep Ayodele. The bargain about surviving 1,000 drownings was just one more cruelty, one more way to torture her with false hope. "No arrangements," Thorpe said finally, avoiding Margaret's eyes. "We have a deal, Garrett. Take the girl." Time seemed to slow. Margaret heard herself screaming, heard Ayodele crying, heard Sister Ruth and others shouting. She lunged for her daughter, but Pike and 2 other overseers grabbed her, holding her back with iron grips. "Mama!" Ayodele shrieked, reaching for her. "Mama, don't let them take me, please!" "I won't." Margaret fought like a wildcat, biting, clawing, kicking. "You can't have her. She's mine. She's my baby." They dragged Ayodele away, the girl screaming and crying, her voice getting smaller as they loaded her onto Garrett's wagon with 6 other enslaved people. A coffle bound together with chains, headed for the auction block in Natchez. Margaret broke free for just a moment, ran after the wagon. managed to grab Ayadel's hand through the bars. "Remember what I taught you," she said urgently, tears streaming down her face. "Remember the North Star. Remember the songs. Remember you're a queen's daughter. Remember—" Pike's whip cracked across her back and she fell. The wagon kept moving. Ayadel's sobs faded into the distance, and then she was gone. Gone. Margaret lay in the dirt, bleeding from the whip strike, her world shattered completely. Around her, the other enslaved people stood in shocked silence, many crying openly. They'd all lost children, family, loved ones to the auction block. They knew this particular hell intimately. Sister Ruth knelt beside Margaret, trying to help her up, but Margaret didn't move. She just lay there, staring at the empty road where the wagon had disappeared, her mind unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. "Get up," Pike ordered. "Back to work, all of you. Show's over." But Margaret didn't get up. Not then. Not when they whipped her for disobedience. Not when they dragged her to the quarters and left her on her pallet. She lay there for 3 days, barely eating, barely drinking, staring at nothing. Old Minda tried to give her herbs to ease her grief. Sister Ruth tried to comfort her with prayers and memories. But Margaret was beyond comfort. The last piece of her heart that could feel anything had been ripped away and sold for $2,000. On the 4th day, Thorpe sent for her. She went like a ghost, hollow and empty. When she entered his study, he was counting money. Probably the same money Garrett had paid for Ayadel. "You look terrible," Thorpe observed, "but that's understandable. I know you cared for that girl." He paused, shuffling bills. "I want you to know it wasn't personal, it was business. Surely you understand that." Margaret looked at him with dead eyes. "You promised," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "You said if I survived 1,000 drownings." "I lied," Thorpe said simply. "What did you expect? I'm a businessman, not a charity. And frankly, your daughter was worth more to me sold than kept. Though I must say, watching you suffer has been entertaining." Something crystallized in that moment. Margaret had survived 600 drownings. She'd endured rape, violation, torture, the loss of 3 children, years of brutal labor and degradation. But this casual admission of cruelty, this proud declaration that her suffering was entertainment, this was the final crack in whatever restraint had kept her from murder. "I'm going to kill you," Margaret said calmly, matter-of-factly, like she was discussing the weather. Thorpe laughed. "You? Kill me? You've said that before, Margaret. And yet here we are, with you still in chains and me still in control." "Not for long," she said. "I swear on Yamoja, on the ancestors, on the Mississippi River itself. I will drown you in those same waters you used to torture me. I will hold your head under till you beg and plead the way my children begged. And I will feel nothing but satisfaction when you take your last breath." Thorpe's smile faded. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. A cold certainty, a promise that transcended hope or fear. "Get out," he said, "and you'll do 50 drownings tomorrow for that threat. Maybe 100. "Do 1,000, Margaret said. "Do 10,000. Everyone just makes me stronger. Everyone just hardens my resolve. You can drown me till Judgment Day, but you can't kill what you've created. And you've created your own death, Harlan Thorpe. You just don't know it yet." She walked out of his study, and though her heart was broken, though her last child was sold away, though everything she loved had been taken from her, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Cold, hard, murderous purpose. The Mississippi whispered its approval that night. The ancestors gathered close, and in the quarters, Margaret began to plan in earnest, no longer held back by love or hope or fear. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her the most dangerous person on Thornwood Plantation. Now you see, people, when a soul loses everything, 2 paths open before them. Surrender to despair or become something beyond human limitation. Margaret chose the second path, and in doing so, she tapped into powers older than slavery itself, forces that had sustained our people through the Middle Passage, through centuries of bondage, through horrors that should have destroyed us completely. After Adele was sold away, Margaret stopped pretending. She no longer bowed her head in false submission when Thorpe passed. She no longer flinched when the overseers approached. Her body went through the motions of work and survival, but her spirit had traveled elsewhere, into the realm of conjure and planning, of ancient wisdom and patient vengeance. "That woman ain't right no more," Pike muttered to the other overseers, watching Margaret work the cotton fields with mechanical precision. "She got something dark in her eyes. Makes my skin crawl." He was right to be afraid. Margaret had crossed over into that territory where suffering becomes power, where pain transforms into purpose, and she wasn't working alone anymore. Sister Ruth was the first to join her secret circle. One night, sitting by the fire in the quarters long after the others had gone to sleep, Ruth spoke quietly. "I know what you planning, child. I can see it plain as day. You gonna kill that man, ain't you?" Margaret looked at her with those cold, dead eyes. "Yes." "Good," Ruth said simply. "Tell me how I can help." From there, the network grew. Old Minda, the conjure woman who delivered Margaret into this world, offered her knowledge of roots and herbs. Esther, who taught Margaret about healing plants years ago, revealed she knew darker arts too. Poisons that mimicked natural illness, powders that brought confusion and weakness. "This here's oleander," Esther whispered, showing Margaret a innocent-looking plant behind the quarters. 3 leaves ground fine in his whiskey, he'll be sick for a week. 6 leaves, he might not wake up. But it's traceable, so you got to be careful. Margaret absorbed everything like parched earth drinks rain. She learned which mushrooms caused hallucinations, which roots brought on fever, which combinations of herbs could make a man's heart race or slow to dangerous levels. But she also learned patience. "You can't just poison him outright," old Minda warned. "They'd know. They'd hang every one of us from the quarters just for suspicion. No, if you gonna do this, it got to look natural. Like an accident. Or like the river claimed him," Margaret said softly. Minda's eyes glittered with understanding. "Yes, like that." But Margaret needed more than poison knowledge. She needed to understand the spiritual dimension of what she was attempting. Taking a life, even a life as evil as Thorpe's, had consequences in the spirit world. The ancestors had to be consulted. The old gods had to be appeased. Uncle Josiah, the root doctor who'd taught her about Yamoja, became her spiritual guide. He was maybe 70 years old, bent and weathered, but his mind was sharp as a razor, and his connection to the old ways ran deep. "Come with me tonight," he told Margaret one evening. "To the Hush Harbor. It's time you learned proper conjure." Deep in the woods beyond the plantation, hidden by cypress trees and Spanish moss, the enslaved folks had created a secret worship space. Here, away from white supervision, they could practice the old African religions mixed with Christianity, could call on orishas and saints, could work roots and speak in tongues without fear of punishment. That night, under a waning moon, Uncle Josiah initiated Margaret into deeper mysteries. He drew symbols in the dirt, crossroads, spirals, marks that represented gates between worlds. He burned herbs that made the air thick with smoke and vision, and he taught her how to petition the powers for assistance. "You want justice against this man?" Josiah asked, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual. "Then you got to make an offering. Blood calls to blood. Water calls to water. What you willing to give?" "My life, if necessary," Margaret answered without hesitation. "No," Josiah shook his head. "Your life ain't yours to give no more. It belongs to the ancestors, to the struggle, to all the children yet unborn who need to know resistance is possible. You gotta offer something else." He handed her a small knife. "Your pain, your suffering, all them 600 drownings, that's power, child. Power born from endurance. You offer that power to Yamoja, to the river spirits, and ask them to turn the tables. Ask them to make the oppressor know what the oppressed has endured." Margaret took the knife and cut her palm, let her blood drip onto the earth. She spoke the prayer Josiah taught her, words in Yoruba mixed with English, calling on Yamoja, on ocean, on the ancestors who'd survived the Middle Passage, on every spirit that understood righteous vengeance. As her blood soaked into the ground, Margaret felt something shift. The air grew heavy, the woods grew silent, and then, clear as if someone spoke directly in her ear, she heard a voice. "The river will help you, but you must be patient. Wait for the storm. Wait for the moment when earth and water conspire, then strike." Margaret gasped, and Uncle Josiah nodded, satisfied. "They heard you. They answered. Now you wait." But waiting didn't mean being idle. Margaret used the following months to gather information, to study Thorpe's patterns and weaknesses. She learned he drank heavy most nights, stumbling drunk by 10 o'clock. She learned he liked to walk by the river when he was troubled, staring at the water as if seeking answers in its depths. She learned his wife had stopped sleeping in his bed, that his overseers respected him out of fear but held no loyalty, that his debts continued to mount. She also formed an unlikely alliance. There was a man in the quarters named Daniel, maybe 30 years old, who'd been sold to Thornwood from a plantation in Virginia. He was strong, smart, and quietly furious about his bondage. He'd tried to run twice, been caught and punished severely both times. Now he wore iron collars and worked under extra supervision, but his spirit wasn't broken, just buried deep and waiting. Margaret approached him carefully one evening. "You want to be free, Daniel?" He looked at her suspiciously. "What kind of question is that? Of course I want to be free, we all do. I mean really free, not just dreaming about it. Actually free." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You talking about running again? 'Cause I tried that. Didn't work." "I'm talking about something else," Margaret said quietly. "About making it so the man who keeps us here can't keep nobody no more." Understanding dawned slowly. "You talking about killing Massa Thorpe?" "I'm talking about justice," Margaret corrected. "I'm talking about a debt being paid. You in or not?" Daniel studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that convinced him she wasn't just talking wild. "I'm in. What you need me to do?" "I need you strong," Margaret said. "When the time comes, I might need you to help me move something heavy, a body maybe, into the river." Daniel nodded slowly. "I can do that." The network continued to grow. A house servant named Bell started reporting Thorpe's schedule and habits. A field hand named Jacob agreed to create a distraction if needed. Even some of the children got involved, running messages between the quarters and the hush harbor, their innocence protecting them from suspicion. But progress was slow, and Margaret's patience was tested repeatedly. Thorpe continued to summon her for violations, continued to use her body as his property. Each time was agony, but Margaret endured, knowing that every violation was another nail in his coffin, another crime added to the debt that would be collected. The drownings continued too. Thorpe seemed determined to reach that 1,000 he'd once mentioned, throwing her in the river for increasingly petty reasons. By late autumn, the count had reached 650, then 700. Margaret's body adapted even more, her lungs developing capacity beyond normal human limitation, her mind learning to enter a trance state that made the drownings almost meditative. "You really are unkillable," Pike said one day, hauling her up from her 725th plunge. "It ain't natural." "Maybe I'm already dead," Margaret said, water streaming from her hair. "Maybe you've been drowning a ghost." The comment unsettled Pike enough that he didn't throw her back in. He backed away, making a sign against evil, and Margaret smiled coldly. "Good. Let them be afraid. Let them wonder." Fear was a weapon too. As winter approached, Margaret felt the moment drawing near. The storms that came with the season would provide the perfect cover. The river would be high and treacherous, and Thorpe, she'd learned, had a habit of walking the riverbank even in bad weather when his troubled mind needed space. She prepared herself physically and spiritually. She fasted for 3 days, drinking only water. She bathed in a mixture of herbs Esther prepared. She spent nights at the hush harbor, praying to the ancestors, feeling their presence grow stronger around her. Old Minda read the signs, chicken bones scattered in the dirt, patterns in ashes the way smoke moved in still air. Soon, she pronounced. Very soon. The spirits say within the next full moon cycle, your moment will come. Margaret felt it too. Could feel destiny approaching like thunder in the distance. 20 years of bondage. 3 children lost. 600 drownings. Countless violations and degradations. The debt was enormous and payment was coming due. She stood by the river one night, watching the dark water flow past, and she spoke to it like an old friend. You and me, she whispered. We got an agreement. You helped me survive all them times they tried to kill me. Now you gonna help me return the favor. You gonna swallow him whole and never give him back. The river seemed to answer, its current shifting, eddies forming patterns that looked almost like hands reaching up from the depths. Soon, very soon. Margaret could taste it in the air, could feel it in her bones. The storm was gathering, the moment was approaching, and when it came, she'd be ready. The ancestors would bear witness, Yamoja would guide her hand, and Harlan Thorpe would finally understand what it meant to drown. Lord have mercy, child. What I'm about to tell you now is the darkest chapter in Margaret's testimony, the final forging in fire and water that transformed her from suffering victim into avenging angel. This is when the 600th drowning came, not just another number in a terrible count, but a threshold crossed, a baptism completed, a warrior fully born. It started on a February morning, cold enough that frost covered the ground and breath came out in white clouds. Margaret was working the cotton gin with other enslaved folks when Pike appeared, his face twisted with that particular malice that meant trouble. Massa wants you, he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. Says you've been slow in your work, disrespectful in your manner. Says it's time for another lesson. Margaret set down her tools slowly. She'd been expecting this. Thorpe had been drinking heavy the past few nights, and when he drank heavy, he got mean. She followed Pike toward the river, her heart steady as a drum, her mind already preparing for what was to come. But this time was different. This time, Thorpe stood at the riverbank with all his overseers, with house servants forced to watch, with a gathered crowd of enslaved people pulled from their work. This wasn't just punishment. This was spectacle. Margaret, Thorpe called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. Come here. She approached, her face blank, giving him nothing. Do you know how many times we've done this? He asked conversationally. The drowning? No, massa, she lied. She knew exactly. 599 times she'd been thrown into the Mississippi. She'd kept count like rosary beads, each one a prayer for vengeance. Well, I do, Thorpe pulled out a ledger. Because I keep records of everything. Productivity, costs, discipline. And according to my records, you've survived 599 drownings. That's remarkable, unprecedented really. He smiled his evil smile. So I thought we should make today special. Number 600, a nice round number. Murmurs rippled through the gathered enslaved. 600. The number seemed impossible, mythical. How could any human body survive being drowned 600 times? But we're not just going to do one plunge today, Thorpe continued. Oh no, we're going to do something different. We're going to see if you can survive 601, 602, 603. We're going to keep going until you break, until you beg, until you finally learn your place. Margaret looked at him with cold eyes. I already know my place. It's standing over your grave. The gathered crowd gasped. No one spoke to Massa like that. No one with any sense of self-preservation. But Margaret was beyond caring about consequences. She'd lost everything already. What more could they take? Thorpe's face went red with rage. Tie her. Double weights this time. They bound her wrists so tight the rope cut into flesh. They attached iron weights to her ankles, heavier than ever before. And then they threw her into the Mississippi on that cold February morning. Water so frigid it stopped her heart for a moment. Down Margaret went, into the murky depths. But this time, instead of fighting, she relaxed into it. She'd done this so many times that her body knew the rhythm, knew how to conserve oxygen, knew how to let the water embrace her without panic. Under the water, in the cold darkness, she saw them again. The ancestors, Her mama, Amma, sold away and likely dead by now. Her daddy, Solomon, worked to death in a Mississippi chain gang. Her children, Samuel, Moses, and Iadel, stolen and scattered. They surrounded her in the depths, their spirits bright in the murky water. "This is your 600th baptism," they seem to say. "This is your transformation completed. After today, you will be something new, something they cannot break." They pulled her up. She gasped, coughed, breathed. They threw her back down. 601. The day wore on. Morning became afternoon. The gathered crowd grew larger as word spread through the plantation. Massa was trying to drown Margaret to death finally, after all these years. Some watched in horror. Some watched in fascination. Some prayed quietly for her soul. 610, 620, 630. Margaret's body should have failed by now. Her lungs should have given out. Her heart should have stopped. Her brain should have been starved of oxygen too long. But something beyond physical endurance sustained her. The ancestors held her up. Yamoja breathed for her when her own lungs couldn't. The river itself became her ally, protecting the woman who'd suffered in its waters so many times. Pike started to look worried. "Massa, maybe we should stop. This ain't natural. She should be dead by now." "I don't care if she's protected by the devil himself," Thorpe snarled, drunk now and past reason. "Keep going." 650, 670, 690. The sun began to set. Margaret was barely conscious now, her body moving on pure instinct and spiritual power. Each time they pulled her up, she emerged not weaker, but somehow stronger, more resolved, more transformed. At 699, something shifted in the spiritual realm. Old Minda, watching from the crowd, felt it first. A change in the air pressure, a gathering of unseen forces. The river itself seemed to grow darker, more agitated, its current shifting in ways that defied natural explanation. "Stop!" she called out, her voice cracking with urgency. "Stop now! The spirits are angry! You tampering with forces you don't understand!" But Thorpe was beyond listening. He grabbed the rope himself, threw Margaret into the water for the 700th time, and this time, the Mississippi answered. The water around Margaret began to glow faintly, a phosphorescent light that had no earthly source. The current swirled in impossible patterns. And in the depths, Margaret heard Yamoja's voice clear as crystal. "You have paid your dues, daughter. You have been baptized in suffering 700 times. Now rise. Rise transformed. Rise empowered. Rise ready." When they pulled Margaret up from that 700th drowning, everyone saw she'd changed. Her eyes, which had been dark brown, now held flecks of deep blue like river water. Her skin, though still dark, seemed to shimmer faintly in the fading light. And when she opened her mouth, river water poured out, gallons of it, more than her body could possibly hold. "Sweet Jesus," Pike whispered, backing away. "She ain't human no more." Even Thorpe looked shaken. But his pride wouldn't let him show fear. "Take her to the quarters, we're done for today." They cut her loose and Margaret stood, dripping, transformed. She looked directly at Thorpe, and he flinched from what he saw in her eyes. 700, she said, her voice resonating with power that hadn't been there before. 700 times you tried to kill me. 700 times the river gave me back. You should have learned by now. I cannot be drowned, but you can. She walked away, leaving Thorpe standing speechless by the river, and the gathered enslaved parted before her like she was Moses parting the Red Sea. In the quarters that night, word spread that Margaret had become something more than human. Some called her a haint walking in flesh. Some called her a warrior blessed by African gods. Some said she'd made a pact with the devil himself. But old Minda knew the truth. She gathered Margaret close, examined her eyes, felt her pulse, listened to her breathing. "Child, you've crossed over," Minda said with reverence. "You've been to the other side so many times that you brought some of it back with you. You're blessed now, protected. The river won't never take you because you belong to it. You and it are one." Margaret nodded. She could feel it, a connection to the Mississippi that went beyond the physical. She could sense its moods, its currents, its hunger, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that when the time came, the river would help her claim what was owed. Uncle Josiah came that night to the quarters, looked at Margaret with his old wise eyes and smiled. The 700th drowning was your completion. You ready now? You understand? I'm ready, Margaret confirmed. Then we wait for the storm, Josiah said. 3 nights from now, if I read the signs right. Big storm coming. River gonna be high and hungry. That's your moment. Margaret spent the next 3 days in preparation. She fasted, taking only water from the river itself. She bathed in herbs that Esther prepared. She visited the hush harbor each night, praying to the ancestors, feeling their approval and support. Sister Ruth came to her on the 3rd evening. You really gonna do this? Kill him? Yes, Margaret said simply. And after? What happens to you after? Margaret shrugged. Don't matter, long as he's dead and can't hurt nobody else, long as his debt is paid. You've become someone else, Ruth observed, not with judgment but with sadness. That girl I knew, the one who loved her children and sang in the quarters. Where'd she go? She drowned, Margaret said quietly. Somewhere around drowning number 300 maybe, or when they sold Odell. Or maybe before that when Thorpe first forced himself on me. That girl couldn't survive what I've survived, so she died, and I was born. Ruth hugged her then, long and tight. I understand, and I'll help however I can. The storm arrived on schedule, rolling in from the Gulf with thunder that shook the quarters and lightning that split the sky. The wind howled like souls in torment, and the Mississippi rose swollen and dangerous. Thorpe, true to his patterns, stood at the riverbank despite the storm, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, staring at the churning water. He did this when troubled, seeking some kind of answers in the depths. Margaret watched from the shadows, Daniel beside her, both of them waiting. This is it, she whispered. Tonight, the debt gets paid. The river roared its agreement, hungry and ready. Listen here now, child, 'cause this is where everything changes. This is where 20 years of suffering crystallize into one single moment of reckoning. The storm that night wasn't just weather. It was the ancestors gathering, the spirits conspiring, nature itself bending to witness justice finally arriving at Thornwood Plantation. The day started quiet, too quiet. The air hung heavy with the kind of stillness that comes before violence, when even the birds know to seek shelter. Margaret worked the fields mechanically, her mind elsewhere, feeling the approaching storm in her bones the way old folks can predict rain from their aching joints. Old Minda approached her mid-morning, pretending to adjust her head wrap while whispering urgently. Tonight's the night. I seen it in the chicken bones this morning. The river's hungry. The spirits are ready. You prepared? I've been preparing for 20 years, Margaret answered, her voice flat with certainty. By afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, building like mountains of anger. The overseers called everyone in early, knowing a big storm was brewing. Even Pike seemed nervous, watching the sky with worried eyes. Get to the quarters and stay there, he shouted. Nobody goes wandering tonight, you hear? Storm's gonna be a bad one. But Margaret had other plans. She returned to her cabin, where Sister Ruth had prepared a bundle. Dark clothes that would blend with night, a rope coiled tight, a small pouch of gopher dust for protection. Esther had contributed a vial of bitter herbs. If things go wrong, Esther explained, and they try to hang you, drink this. It'll make your passing quick, painless, better than what they do otherwise. Margaret took the vial but had no intention of using it. She wasn't planning to die tonight. Only Thorpe was. As twilight fell, Daniel found her behind the quarters. I'm ready, he said simply. Whatever you need. I need you to be my witness, Margaret told him. I need you to see justice done. And if I fall, I need you to tell the story. Make sure folks know what happened here. Make sure they know Margaret Duafogamento didn't die a victim. She died a warrior. You ain't gonna die. Daniel said with conviction. I feel it. The spirits are with you tonight. The storm broke just after nightfall with fury that shook the very foundations of the big house. Rain came down in sheets, wind bent trees nearly double, and lightning split the sky so bright it turned night into day for heartbeats at a time. Thunder rolled like drums from Africa, announcing that something momentous was about to occur. In his study, Thorpe drank alone, his wife having retired early with a headache. He'd been drinking since mid-afternoon, and by now he was well into his cups, brooding over his mounting debts and failing plantation. The storm outside matched his internal turmoil. Margaret watched from the shadows near the quarters, rain soaking through her clothes, waiting. She'd learned Thorpe's patterns over 20 years, knew that when he was this drunk and troubled, he'd eventually wander to the river, seeking solace in the water that had been his favorite instrument of torture. Come on, she whispered to the storm. Bring him out, bring him to the water. As if in answer, the back door of the big house opened. Thorpe emerged, stumbling slightly, whiskey bottle in hand. He pulled his coat tight against the rain and headed toward the riverbank, just as Margaret had predicted. She followed at a distance, Daniel ghosting behind her. The storm provided perfect cover. The rain masked their footsteps. The thunder covered any sound they might make. They were shadows in the tempest, instruments of justice in human form. At the riverbank, Thorpe stood swaying, staring at the swollen Mississippi. The water was high and fierce, running fast with debris from upstream. Lightning illuminated the churning surface, making it look like a living thing, hungry and wild. All those drownings, Thorpe muttered to himself, too drunk to notice he wasn't alone. 700 times I threw her in and she just keeps coming back, like she's cursed, or I am. He took a long pull from his bottle. Maybe I should have just killed her outright. Would have been kinder. Kinder? Margaret's voice cut through the storm. You don't know the meaning of the word. Thorpe spun around, nearly losing his balance. His eyes widened when he saw her standing there, rain streaming down her face, her eyes reflecting lightning like blue fire. You, he said, his voice slurred. What are you doing here? Get back to the quarters before you what? Margaret stepped closer. Throw me in the river? Drown me? We both know that don't work no more. I've been baptized in these waters 700 times. They can't kill me, but they can kill you. Thorpe tried to reach for the pistol he usually carried, but in his drunken state he'd left it in the house. His hands fumbled uselessly at his coat. You threatening me, girl? He tried to sound authoritative, but fear crept into his voice. You know what happens to slaves who threaten white men? I know what happens to evil men who violate women and sell children, Margaret countered, moving closer still. I know about debts that come due. I know about justice delayed but not denied. She began to circle him, and Thorpe turned to keep her in sight, his back getting closer to the river's edge. Daniel emerged from the shadows on the other side, boxing Thorpe in. Two of you? Thorpe laughed nervously. You think two slaves can harm me? There's laws, there's order, you'll hang for this. Maybe, Margaret said calmly, but you'll drown first. She moved fast, faster than Thorpe's drunk reflexes could handle. She grabbed his coat, twisted, using his own momentum against him. Daniel moved in from behind, pushing, and together, they sent Harlan Thorpe tumbling into the Mississippi. The river welcomed him like an old friend, pulling him under immediately. He surfaced, sputtering, screaming, Help! Help me! Can't swim. I'll drown. I know, Margaret said coldly, standing at the edge. I've been drowning in these waters for 20 years. Now it's your turn. How's it feel, Massa? How's it feel to know you're about to die? Thorpe thrashed, going under, coming up, going under again. The current was strong, pulling him toward the middle of the river where the water ran deep and deadly. Please, he begged, all pride stripped away. Please, I'm sorry, I'll free you. I'll free all of you. Just help me. You had 20 years to be sorry, Margaret said. 20 years to show mercy. You showed none. Now the river shows you the same mercy you showed me, none at all. She watched as Thorpe went under again, his arms flailing weakly. Part of her wanted to savor this moment, to stretch it out, to make him suffer as long as she'd suffered. But another part of her, the part that still held some humanity, just wanted it over. "Yamoja," she called out to the river spirits. "Take him. Take your due. Let this debt be paid in full." As if responding to her command, the current shifted. A whirlpool formed around Thorpe, pulling him down into the depths. He screamed one last time, a sound of pure terror, and then the water closed over his head. Margaret waited, watched. Lightning lit the churning surface. Thunder rolled, rain poured down. Thorpe didn't come back up. Minutes passed. The storm began to ease slightly. Still no Thorpe. The Mississippi had claimed him, pulled him down into the mud and darkness, given him the death he'd inflicted on Margaret 700 times. Daniel stood beside her, both of them soaked to the bone, watching the river. "It's done," he said quietly. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It's done." But even as she said it, she felt no triumph, no joy, no relief, just emptiness. 20 years of pain couldn't be erased by one act of vengeance. Her children were still lost. Her body still bore the scars of violation. Her soul still carried the weight of suffering. Justice had been served, but healing, that would take longer. Maybe a lifetime, maybe forever. "We need to go," Daniel urged. "Before someone finds us here." Margaret nodded. They turned to leave, but before they did, she spoke one last time to the river. "Thank you," she whispered, "for holding me all those times, for teaching me to survive, for taking him when the time came." The river seemed to answer, its current shifting in acknowledgement, and Margaret swore she heard Yamoja's voice one final time. "You are free now, daughter. Not free from bondage. That will take more than one man's death. But free in spirit, free in soul. You have reclaimed yourself." They returned to the quarters through the storm, and no one saw them. By morning, when Thorpe's absence was noticed, the search began. His body was found 3 days later, miles downriver, caught in roots and debris. "Must have fell in drunk," the sheriff concluded. "Tragic accident." Rivers claimed many a man in storms like that. No one suspected Margaret. No one suspected Daniel. They were just slaves after all. Invisible, beneath notice. But in the quarters, folks knew. They looked at Margaret with new eyes. Respect, awe, and a little fear. She'd done what seemed impossible. She'd killed her oppressor and lived to tell about it. The story would spread, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by the Underground Railroad, passed down through generations. The tale of Margaret do Afogamento, the woman who survived 700 drownings and drowned her tormentor in return. Now you see, people, sometimes the doing of a thing is simpler than the living with it after. Margaret had dreamed of Thorpe's death for so many years that when it finally came, when she finally watched him sink beneath the Mississippi's dark waters, she expected to feel transformed, expected the weight of 20 years to lift from her shoulders like chains breaking. But guilt don't work that way, and neither does grief. The morning after the drowning broke gray and cold, the storm having passed in the night like a fever. Margaret woke in her cabin with her clothes still damp, her body aching from the struggle at the riverbank, and her mind replaying the moment over and over. Thorpe's face as he went under that final time, his hands reaching up from the water like he was clawing at salvation that wouldn't come. Sister Ruth found her sitting outside at dawn, staring at nothing. "You all right, child?" Ruth asked gently, sitting beside her. "I killed a man last night," Margaret said flatly. "Drowned him in the river, watched him die, and I don't know what I feel." "You feel what anyone would feel after surviving hell and finally striking back," Ruth said. "You feel righteous and guilty all at once. You feel free and trapped. That's human, Margaret. That's what makes you different from him. You still got a conscience." By mid-morning, the plantation was in chaos. Mrs. Thorpe had noticed her husband missing, sent the overseers looking. They found his study empty, whiskey bottle on the desk, his coat gone. Pike organized a search party, checking the quarters, the fields, the outbuildings. "Anybody seen Massa Thorpe?" Pike demanded, going cabin to cabin. The enslaved people shook their heads, kept their eyes down, spoke their ignorance. Nobody knew nothing. Nobody saw nothing. The code of silence that protected runaways now protected Margaret and Daniel. But Pike wasn't stupid. He went straight to Margaret's cabin, looked at her with suspicious eyes. "You were out last night," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," Margaret lied smoothly. "I was here all night. Storm was too fierce to go wandering. Ask Sister Ruth. Ask anybody in the quarters." "That's right," Ruth confirmed, stepping up beside Margaret. "She was here with us. We all huddled together during the storm, praying it would pass." Pike studied them both, clearly not believing but unable to prove otherwise. "If I find out you had anything to do with Massa going missing, you'll what?" Margaret met his eyes directly, something she'd never dared before. "Throw me in the river? We both know how that works out." Pike flinched. The memory of 700 drownings hung between them like a ghost. He backed away, muttering curses, and continued his search elsewhere. By afternoon, they'd expanded the search to the river. That's where Daniel, playing his part perfectly, discovered something. "Over here," he called out, pointing to the muddy bank. "Look like someone fell in. Footprints, and they lead right to the edge." The overseers gathered, examining the marks. The rain had washed away most details, but the story seemed clear enough. Thorpe had walked to the river drunk, slipped in the mud, fallen in the swollen waters, been swept away by the current. "Damn fool," Pike muttered. "How many times I tell him not to drink so much and wander around?" They searched the river for hours but found nothing. The Mississippi had swallowed Thorpe whole, and it wasn't giving him back easily. Mrs. Thorpe wailed in the big house, more from fear of her uncertain future than from genuine grief. The enslaved people went through the motions of concern while privately celebrating their oppressor's demise. 3 days later, a fisherman found Thorpe's body caught in a snag 15 miles downriver. By then, the fish in the current had done their work. The corpse was bloated, barely recognizable, definitively dead. The sheriff came, examined the body, questioned the overseers and a few trusted house servants. His conclusion was swift and unsurprising. "Accidental drowning," he declared. "Man was known to drink heavy. Storm was fierce that night. River was high and dangerous. Tragic, but not uncommon. I've seen a dozen men die this way." No investigation into the enslaved population. No interrogation of suspects. Why would there be? Slaves didn't kill masters. That was unthinkable. And even if they did, who'd believe it? Who'd care? Thorpe was buried in the family plot with minimal ceremony. Mrs. Thorpe, faced with running a plantation she'd never paid attention to, quickly sold the whole operation to a neighbor, a man named Randall who was only marginally less cruel than Thorpe had been. The enslaved people were part of the sale, transferred like furniture. But something had changed on the plantation. Word of Thorpe's death had spread through the quarters like wildfire, and though nobody spoke it aloud, everyone knew. Margaret had done it. Margaret do Afogamento had killed her oppressor and gotten away with it. It gave people hope. Dangerous, powerful hope. "If she could do it," young folks whispered, "maybe we can too." "If the river could claim one massa," others murmured, "it can claim others." Old Minda warned Margaret privately. "You've become a symbol now, child. That's powerful, but it's also dangerous. Folks gonna look to you for leadership. Gonna expect you to lead them to freedom." "I can't lead nobody nowhere," Margaret said wearily. "I just wanted justice for what was done to me. For my children. That's all." "That's how revolutions start," Minda said wisely. "One person saying no more. One person striking back. You planted a seed, Margaret, whether you wanted to or not." In the weeks that followed, Margaret struggled with what she'd done. At night, she dreamed of Thorpe's drowning. Sometimes she felt satisfaction, sometimes horror, sometimes both at once. She'd wake gasping, feeling water in her lungs even though she was safe on her pallet. Daniel became her closest ally, the only other person who truly understood what had happened that night. They'd sit together sometimes in the evenings, not speaking much, just sharing the weight of their secret. "You regret it?" he asked one night. Margaret thought for a long time before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the world made monsters like Thorpe possible. I regret every violation, every child stolen, every drowning I endured. But killing him? No. That I don't regret. He earned his death 1,000 times over. You think your children are still alive? Daniel asked gently. Samuel, Moses, Iadel. I pray they are, Margaret said. I pray they survived, found kindness somewhere, maybe even freedom. But I'll probably never know. That's the cruelest part. Not the not seeing them again, but the not knowing. Spring turned to summer under the new ownership. Randall proved to be a hard master, but not a sadistic one. He didn't use the drowning torture, didn't call Margaret to the big house for violations, mostly left the enslaved people alone as long as they worked hard and caused no trouble. But Margaret was restless. She'd tasted justice, however brutal, and it had awakened something in her. She began meeting more frequently at the Hush Harbor, listening to reports from the Underground Railroad, learning about escape routes and safe houses. You thinking about running? Sister Ruth asked, seeing the look in Margaret's eyes. I'm thinking about freedom, Margaret answered. Real freedom, not just the death of one evil man, but liberation from the whole evil system. Uncle Josiah, old and frail now, gave her his blessing. You done what the spirits called you to do here. Maybe it's time to move on. Find your children if you can. Help others find freedom. You got power now, Margaret. Use it for more than revenge. She began to plan in earnest. Not a solo escape. Those rarely succeeded for women her age. But something larger. A group escape like the stories she'd heard from other plantations. 10 or 12 people, moving together through the network of safe houses, heading north to states where slavery was illegal, or even to Canada where they'd be truly free. Daniel was in immediately. So were Ruth and Esther. A few young men from the fields, strong and willing to fight if necessary. 2 families with small children who were desperate to give their kids a better life. They gathered supplies slowly, carefully. Dried food hidden in false bottoms of supply barrels. Old clothes modified for travel. Maps memorized from whispered descriptions. Passwords learned for contacting Underground Railroad conductors. The escape was planned for late August, when the cotton needed harvesting, and all hands would be expected in the fields from dawn to dusk, when missing people might not be noticed until nightfall. But 3 weeks before they were set to run, a slave catcher came through, hunting a runaway from a neighboring plantation. He questioned everyone, examined faces, made threats. The atmosphere grew tense, dangerous. Patrols increased, dogs were brought in. We might have to move up the timeline, Daniel said urgently, or call it off completely. Margaret looked at the faces of those who'd agreed to run with her, people who trusted her, who believed in her, who saw her as a leader whether she wanted that role or not. We run, she decided. Tomorrow night, ready or not, we run. Sister Ruth gripped her hand. You sure? I'm sure, Margaret said. I didn't survive 700 drownings just to die enslaved. I didn't kill Thorpe just to live under another master. Freedom or death, that's all that's left to me now. Tomorrow night, they'd make their attempt. Tomorrow night, they'd trust in the North Star, in the conductors of the Underground Railroad, in the same ancestral spirits that had protected Margaret through all her drownings. Tomorrow night, they'd run toward freedom, and whatever happened after would be in the hands of God and the ancestors. Margaret stood at the edge of the quarters, looking toward the river that had been her torment and her salvation. The Mississippi flowed on, eternal and indifferent, having swallowed Thorpe and countless others, having witnessed unspeakable horrors and occasional triumphs. Thank you, she whispered one more time, for everything, for keeping me alive when they tried to kill me, for taking him when justice demanded it. Now guide us north, guide us to freedom. The river whispered back, its current carrying promises of liberation or death, and Margaret was ready for either. Now listen here, child. Even when justice been served and the wicked man lies dead at the bottom of the Mississippi, the world don't stop turning. Evil don't disappear just cause one devil drowns. And freedom? Lord have mercy. Freedom is a road walked in blood and tears, paved with the bones of those who tried and failed before you. The night before the planned escape, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet in the quarters, listening to the breathing of others around her, knowing that tomorrow everything would change, one way or another. Either they'd taste freedom for the first time in their lives, or they'd die trying. Both outcomes seemed better than remaining in bondage. Sister Ruth whispered from her own pallet. "You awake?" "Can't sleep," Margaret admitted. "Me neither. Been thinking about my grandbaby, sold away 5 years back. Wondering if I'll ever see her again, or if running north just means dying without ever knowing what happened to her." "We all got ghosts chasing us," Margaret said quietly. "My 3 children out there somewhere. Your grandbaby, Daniel's wife, sold downriver. We running toward freedom, but we also running from memories that won't never let us go." "You scared?" Ruth asked. "Terrified," Margaret confessed, "but more scared of staying, of dying enslaved, of never even trying." Morning came too fast and too slow all at once. The enslaved people went about their work as usual, but those in Margaret's circle moved with heightened awareness. They positioned themselves strategically throughout the day, some in the fields closest to the woods, others near the supply shed where they'd hidden provisions, a few working the big house who could report on overseer movements. Pike seemed unusually vigilant that day, walking the fields more frequently than normal, his eyes suspicious. Margaret wondered if he sensed something, if some instinct warned him that rebellion was brewing. "You there?" he called out to Margaret mid-morning. "Come here." Her heart went heavy, chest got tight. Had they been discovered? Did someone betray the plan? She approached slowly, keeping her face neutral. "Yes, sir?" Pike studied her with narrowed eyes. "You've been acting different since Massa Thorpe died. Bolder, less fearful. Makes me wonder if you know something about his death that you ain't told." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I know he's dead and can't torture nobody no more. I know the river took him the way he took so many of us. Maybe that's God's justice. Maybe that's just the way things go sometimes. But I ain't got nothing to do with it." Pike stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "I don't believe you. I think you drowned that man. I think you and maybe that Daniel fellow pushed him in the river and watched him die. But I can't prove it, not yet." "Then I guess you got nothing to say to me," Margaret said, turning to walk away. Pike grabbed her arm, spinning her back. "You think you won? You think killing one white man changes anything? There's 1,000 more where he came from. And if I ever get proof of what you done, I'll see you hang. I'll watch you swing from a tree and smile while you choke." Margaret pulled her arm free. "You do that, Mr. Pike. You spend your life trying to prove something you can't prove, trying to catch something you can't catch. Meanwhile, I'll keep on living, keep on surviving, keep on winning." She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding but her head high. That exchange had been dangerous, but it also confirmed what she suspected. Pike had suspicions but no evidence. As long as she and Daniel stayed silent, stayed careful, they were safe. For now. The plan was to leave at midnight when the patrols were thinnest and most of the white folks were deep asleep. 12 people total. Margaret, Daniel, Sister Ruth, Esther, old Minda, who insisted on coming despite her age. 3 young men named Jacob, Thomas, and Benjamin, and 4 others including a woman named Sarah with 2 small children. They gathered in the deep woods behind the quarters just after the midnight bell, each carrying a small bundle of provisions. The children had been given herbs to keep them quiet, and they slept in their mama's arms, unaware they were beginning the most dangerous journey of their young lives. "Everybody here?" Margaret did a quick count. 12 souls, all present, all committed. Daniel had the map memorized. First, they'd head northeast through the swamps, avoiding the main roads where patrols ran regular. Then they'd connect with a conductor at a safe house 30 miles north, a free black man who helped runaways. From there, they'd move through a network of stations all the way to Ohio, maybe even Canada if they could make it that far. "Remember," Margaret said quietly, "we stay together. We move quiet. If anyone falls behind, we help them. If dogs come, we split into groups and meet at the rendezvous point. And if we get caught? She paused, meeting each person's eyes. We don't talk. We don't give up nobody else's name. We take our punishment and protect the network. They nodded, understanding. This wasn't just about their freedom. It was about protecting the underground railroad that helped hundreds of freedom seekers every year. They moved into the darkness following the North Star, using the moss on trees to confirm direction. The night was thick with humidity, and mosquitoes swarmed, but no one complained. Discomfort was nothing compared to bondage. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. They covered maybe 5 miles, moving through woods and fields, crossing small creeks, avoiding the main roads. Margaret felt hope building in her chest. Maybe they'd actually make it. Maybe freedom was possible. Then, just before dawn, they heard it. The baying of hounds in the distance. "Lord have mercy," Sister Ruth whispered. "They know we're gone." They sent the dogs. "How?" Thomas asked, panicked. "We was so careful." But Margaret knew how. Pike. That suspicious overseer had probably been watching, waiting. Maybe he'd done a midnight bed check. Maybe he'd noticed too many people positioning themselves strategically during the day. However, he'd figured it out. "We run," Margaret commanded. "Now. Fast as we can toward the swamp. Dogs can't track in deep water." They ran, crashing through underbrush, the children crying now despite the herbs, the older folks struggling to keep up. The baying grew louder, the dogs were gaining, following their scent with deadly accuracy. "There," Daniel pointed. "The bayou. If we can reach it." A gunshot cracked through the air. They all hit the ground instinctively. When Margaret looked up, she saw torches in the distance, the slave catchers, maybe a dozen of them, closing in. "Split up," she ordered. "Sarah, you take your babies and Esther head northeast. Ruth, Minda, Jacob, with me toward the water. Daniel, Thomas, Benjamin, create a diversion, lead them west, then circle back to the rendezvous." "But," Daniel started to protest. "Go," Margaret commanded with the authority of someone who'd survived 700 drownings. "That's an order." They split, 3 groups disappearing into the darkness. Margaret led her group toward the bayou, splashing into the water, feeling mud suck at their feet. The water was murky and dangerous. Gators lived here, snakes too. But it was better than the certainty of recapture. Behind them, the dogs reached their splitting point and, confused by the multiple scents, divided their attention. Some followed Sarah's group, some chased Daniel's, some came toward the water where Margaret led her people deeper into the swamp. "Keep moving," Margaret urged old Minda, who was struggling in the waist-deep water. "Don't stop. Don't look back." They waited for what felt like hours, the water getting deeper, the cypress trees closing in around them. Margaret could hear the dogs and the slave catchers behind them, but the sounds grew fainter. The water was working. The hounds couldn't track scent through bayou water. Just when she thought they might actually escape, Sister Ruth stumbled, crying out. She'd stepped on something sharp, broken glass or a sharp rock, and her foot was bleeding badly. "I can't walk," Ruth gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Go on without me, save yourselves." "Absolutely not," Margaret said fiercely. "We don't leave nobody behind. Jacob, help me carry her." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and cloth, lifting Ruth between them. It slowed them down considerably, but Margaret refused to abandon her friend. They'd come too far together, survived too much together. By dawn, they'd made it through the worst of the swamp and found themselves in thick forest. The sounds of pursuit had faded completely. They'd lost the dogs, at least for now. But they were exhausted, hungry, and Ruth's foot was infected, swelling badly. "We need to find shelter," Jacob said. "Rest and tend to Sister Ruth." They found a cave hidden behind vines and undergrowth, barely visible unless you knew to look. Inside, it was dry and relatively safe. They collapsed, too tired to even eat their meager provisions. Margaret examined Ruth's foot in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. It looked bad. The cut was deep and already showing signs of infection. Without proper medicine, without a doctor, Ruth might lose the foot, might even die from blood poisoning. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered. I'm slowing you down. You should leave me here and keep going." "Stop talking foolishness," Margaret said firmly, cleaning the wound with water from their canteen. "You stood by me through 700 drownings. You held my hand when my children were sold. You kept me alive when I wanted to die. You think I'm gonna abandon you now? Not while I got breath in my body." Old Minda used her knowledge of healing to create a poultice from plants she found near the cave. This should help with the infection, but she needs rest, real rest. Maybe a week before that foot can bear weight again. A week. They didn't have a week. The slave catchers would keep searching. The patrols would be increased. Every day they stayed in one place was a day closer to recapture. But Margaret made a decision. "Then we rest here. We take turns keeping watch. We survive. And when Ruth can walk again, we finish this journey together." "What about the others?" Jacob asked. "Daniel, Sarah, the rest?" "They know the rendezvous point," Margaret said. "If they made it, they'll meet us there. If they didn't..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. That night, while the others slept, Margaret kept first watch at the cave entrance. She looked out at the forest, at the stars barely visible through the canopy, and she prayed. Prayed for Daniel's safety, for Sarah and her babies, for all the freedom seekers running through darkness toward an uncertain future. And she prayed to Yamoja, to the ancestors, to the river that had saved her so many times. "We're still running," she told them silently. "Still fighting, still refusing to surrender. Help us, guide us, bring us home to freedom." The forest whispered back with wind through leaves, and somewhere in that whisper, Margaret thought she heard a promise. "You will make it. Not all of you, but some. And those who make it will carry the story, will testify, will remember. It would have to be enough. Old folks say that freedom ain't a destination, but a journey walked one painful step at a time, through swamps and forests, past patrols and slave catchers, over rivers that might drown you or deliver you to salvation. Margaret learned this truth in those desperate days hiding in the cave, nursing Sister Ruth back to health, while the world outside hunted them like animals. 5 days they stayed in that cave. 5 days of rationing water and dried corn, of keeping watch in shifts, of jumping at every sound that might be dogs or armed men. Ruth's foot improved slowly with Minda's poultices, but she was still weak, still unable to walk far without severe pain. On the 6th morning, Daniel found them. He appeared at the cave entrance like a ghost, thin and exhausted, his clothes torn and muddy. Margaret nearly cried with relief when she saw him alive. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, pulling him into an embrace. "I thought they caught you. I thought you was dead or worse." "Nearly was," Daniel said, collapsing inside the cave. "They chased us for 2 days straight. Thomas got caught. They took him back in chains. Benjamin made it to the safe house and is waiting there for us, but Thomas..." His voice cracked. "They whipped him something terrible in the town square as an example. I watched from the woods, couldn't do nothing to help him." The group fell silent, mourning their lost brother. Thomas had been young, maybe 19, with dreams of learning to read in the Free States. Now, he'd never get that chance. "What about Sarah and the children?" Margaret asked, almost afraid of the answer. "Don't know," Daniel admitted. "We split up like you said. I ain't seen them since that first night. Maybe they made it. Maybe they didn't." Margaret felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her. She'd told them to split up, had given the orders that might have saved some and doomed others. How did you live with that? How did you sleep knowing your decisions determined life and death? "We can't stay here no more," old Minda said practically. "Food's running low. Ruth's strong enough to walk slow, and the longer we wait, the more patrols they send out." They left that afternoon, moving carefully through the forest. Ruth leaned on Margaret and Jacob, hobbling along on her bad foot, biting back cries of pain with every step. Progress was slow, maybe 2 miles in as many hours, but it was progress nonetheless. At dusk, they heard singing in the distance. Not the songs of slave catchers, but a spiritual, sung low and coated with meaning. "Wade in the water," the signal from the Underground Railroad that a conductor was near. "That's the sign," Daniel said, excitement creeping into his exhausted voice. The safe house. We made it. They followed the sound through darkening woods until they reached a small cabin hidden deep in the forest. An old black man stood outside, free papers probably tucked in his pocket, working as a conductor on the railroad. His name was Moses, not the famous Harriet Tubman, but one of the many brave souls who risked everything to guide their people to freedom. "Welcome, travelers," he said quietly, ushering them inside. "Y'all look like you've been through hell itself." "We have," Margaret said simply. Inside the cabin they found Benjamin waiting, and to Margaret's overwhelming relief, Sarah with her 2 children, all safe. The reunion was tearful, joyful, tinged with sorrow for Thomas, who hadn't made it. Moses fed them properly for the first time in days. Cornbread, beans, salt pork, water so clean it tasted like heaven. While they ate, he explained the next leg of their journey. "From here, it's 30 miles to the next station, but the route's dangerous. Patrol's been increased cause of recent runaways. They know folks is heading north and they watching the usual paths." He looked at their group, exhausted, injured, traumatized. "I ain't gonna lie to you. Some of you might not make it. The journey from here gets harder, not easier. We didn't come this far to turn back," Margaret said firmly. Moses nodded, respect in his eyes. "I can see that. You got the look of someone who's fought too hard to quit now. All right then. We rest tonight. Tomorrow night we move." That night, as the others slept in the relative safety of the safe house, Margaret sat outside under the stars. Daniel joined her, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" he asked quietly. "All this running, all this suffering, all this risk. We might die tomorrow, or next week, or get caught and sent back to even worse bondage. Is freedom worth all that?" Margaret thought about her children. Samuel, Moses, Iodel, all lost to her, but maybe somewhere still alive. She thought about the 700 drownings, about Thorpe's body at the bottom of the Mississippi, about every moment of pain and resistance that had brought her to this point. "Yes," she said simply. "Even if I die tomorrow, even if I never see my babies again, even if we all get caught and hanged, yes, it's worth it. Because we tried. Because we refused to accept bondage as our fate. Because we chose freedom over safety, dignity over survival." Daniel took her hand, squeezed it gently. "You're the bravest person I ever knew, Margaret do Affogamento." "I'm the most stubborn," she corrected with a tired smile. "Brave folks got a choice." "Never did. It was resist or die inside, and I chose to resist." The next night they moved again. Moses led them through paths known only to conductors, avoiding main roads, crossing rivers at shallow points, hiding in barns and root cellars during daylight. Other runaways joined their group along the way. A man who'd escaped a chain gang, a woman who'd been sold away from her family, 2 teenagers who'd never known anything but slavery and were desperate to taste freedom. By the time they reached the Ohio River, the boundary between slave states and free territory, their group had grown to 20 souls, all exhausted, all terrified, all determined. "Across that water is freedom," Moses told them, pointing to the dark river. "But getting across ain't easy. Patrols watch the bridges and ferry points. We got to swim or take small boats in the dead of night." Margaret looked at the river and felt a strange kinship with it. Water had been her torment and her teacher. The Mississippi had tried to kill her 700 times and failed. Maybe this river, this Ohio that separated bondage from liberty, would be her final baptism. "I'll go first," she volunteered. "I know water. I ain't afraid of drowning." She stripped down to undergarments, waded into the cold river, and began to swim. The current was strong, but nothing compared to the Mississippi during storms. She'd survived worse. She'd endured worse. This was just one more trial, one more test. Halfway across, she heard dogs barking on the shore they'd left behind. Slave catchers, arriving too late but still dangerous. She swam harder, her arms burning with effort, her lungs aching but holding strong. She reached the far shore and collapsed on the bank, coughing up river water, trembling with cold and exhaustion. But when she looked back at the water, she saw the others coming. Daniel strong and steady, pulling Sister Ruth who couldn't swim, Jacob helping old Minda, Sarah with her children clinging to her back. Not everyone made it. One of the teenagers panicked mid-river and had to be pulled back by Moses. 2 others got caught by the slave catchers before they could even enter the water. Margaret watched from the free shore, helpless, as they were dragged away in chains. But 15 made it across. 15 souls who'd risked everything, lost friends and family, survived hell itself to reach this moment. They stood on the Ohio shore, dripping wet, exhausted beyond measure, and Moses spoke the words they'd dreamed of hearing. Welcome to freedom. Margaret fell to her knees and wept, not tears of joy. She'd lost too much for simple joy, but tears of release, of survival, of finally, impossibly, reaching the other side. Sister Ruth knelt beside her, wrapped arms around her. We made it, child. We actually made it. Not all of us, Margaret said, thinking of Thomas, of the ones caught, of her children still lost somewhere in the slave states. No, Ruth agreed. Not all of us, but some of us, and we gonna carry their stories. Gonna testify for those who couldn't make it. Gonna make sure their suffering meant something. They rested on the free shore while Moses made arrangements for the next leg of their journey. There were conductors in Ohio who'd help them get to Canada, who'd provide clothes and food and shelter. The journey wasn't over. Slave catchers sometimes crossed into free states illegally, and the Fugitive Slave Act meant they could be captured even here. But the worst was behind them. That night, camped in a barn owned by sympathetic Quakers, Margaret finally allowed herself to imagine a future. Maybe she'd never find her children. Maybe she'd carry the scars of bondage forever. Maybe freedom would never feel as sweet as it should because of all she'd lost to gain it. But she was free. After 40 years of life, 20 of them in brutal bondage under Thorpe, she was finally, impossibly, miraculously free. She thought of Yamoja, of the ancestors, of the Mississippi River that had baptized her in suffering and strength. She thought of Thorpe drowning in those same waters, justice finally served, and she made a vow. She'd spend the rest of her free life helping others reach freedom too. She'd become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, guide others across the rivers she'd learned to survive. She'd testify about the horrors of slavery, about the 700 drownings, about the strength of those who resisted. Her story would be told. The tale of Margaret do Afogamento would spread like wildfire through the quarters, giving hope to the hopeless, strength to the weary, proof that resistance was possible. Tomorrow they'd continue north toward Canada. Tomorrow they'd keep running. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Margaret slept truly free. Now gather close one final time, chillun, as I tell you the end of this testimony, though it ain't really an ending, 'cause stories like Margaret's don't ever truly end. They just transform, becoming part of the living memory of our people, carried forward like spiritual songs from one generation to the next. 10 years passed after that night Margaret crossed the Ohio River into freedom. 10 years of building a new life in Canada, in a small settlement of formerly enslaved people who'd made the journey north and carved out existence from wilderness and determination. She lived in a cabin she built with her own hands, worked land that belonged to her, truly hers, not some masses. And each morning she woke up knowing that nobody could sell her, whip her, or drown her ever again. But freedom, Margaret learned, wasn't the absence of chains. It was carrying the weight of survival, of memory, of all those who didn't make it. Sister Ruth lived with her until the old woman passed peacefully in her sleep 3 years after their escape, whispering prayers of gratitude with her last breath. Old Minda made it 5 years before her body, worn down by decades of bondage and the hard journey north, finally gave out. Daniel built a house nearby, married a woman from the settlement, and together they raised children who'd never know the lash, never feel the auction block's shame. Margaret never remarried, never bore more children. The violations she'd endured had left scars too deep for that kind of intimacy, but she found purpose in other ways. becoming one of the most fearless conductors on the Underground Railroad, making dangerous trips back into slave territory to guide others north. "You crazy," other conductors told her when she volunteered for the most perilous missions. "You already free. Why risk it?" "Because I remember," Margaret would answer simply. "I remember every drowning, every child stolen, every woman violated. And as long as I got breath, I'll fight to end that system. I'll guide every soul I can to freedom." Over those 10 years, she personally conducted 47 people to liberty: men, women, children, whole families. Each one she treated like her own lost children, protecting them fierce as a mama bear, using every skill she'd learned, surviving 700 drownings to navigate rivers, evade patrols, outwit slave catchers. The legend of Margaret do Afogamento spread through both free and enslaved communities. Whispered in quarters across the South, her story gave hope to the hopeless. If she could survive 700 drownings, folks would say, if she could kill her master and escape to freedom, then maybe we can too. Some versions of the tale grew larger than life. Stories claimed she could breathe underwater like a fish, that river spirits protected her, that she'd personally drowned a dozen overseers and escaped on a boat made of moonlight. Margaret would laugh when she heard these exaggerations, but she understood their purpose. Our people needed heroes, needed stories of resistance and triumph to sustain them through the darkness of bondage. On a spring morning in 1850, Margaret was maybe 50 years old by then, though nobody kept exact records of enslaved people's births. She stood by a river in Canada, watching the water flow past. It wasn't the Mississippi, but all rivers spoke the same language to her now. All carried memory. All held the stories of those who'd suffered in their depths. A young woman approached, newly arrived via the railroad. "You're her, ain't you?" the woman asked shyly. "Margaret do Afogamento, the legend." "I'm just Margaret," she answered. "A woman who survived. Ain't nothing legendary about survival." "But you killed your master," the young woman pressed. "Drowned him in the river. That took courage I can't even imagine." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking at the water. It took desperation. It took rage. It took 20 years of suffering compressed into one moment of action. And it took help, from spirits, from friends, from the river itself. "I wasn't brave. I was just done being a victim." "Did it feel good?" the young woman asked. "Watching him drown?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "No. It felt necessary. It felt like justice. But good? No. Taking a life, even an evil life, leaves a mark on your soul. I carry that mark still, same as I carry the memory of every drowning I endured." "Do you regret it?" "Never," Margaret said firmly. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret the system that made it necessary. But the act itself? No. Thorpe earned his death 1,000 times over." The young woman nodded, understanding. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow. That night, Margaret gathered with other formerly enslaved people around a fire in the settlement. They did this monthly. Shared meals, shared stories, kept the memory of struggle alive while celebrating their hard-won freedom. Children played nearby, free children who'd never know chains, and their laughter was sweeter than any music. Uncle Josiah's nephew, a conjure man who'd escaped 2 years prior, asked Margaret to tell her story for the new arrivals. She was reluctant at first. The memories still hurt even after a decade, but she recognized the importance. The new folks needed to hear it, needed to understand what they'd survived and what they'd escaped. So Margaret told them. About being born into bondage, about Thorpe's violations and cruelty, about bearing children only to have them stolen and sold, about the 700 drownings that should have killed her but instead transformed her into something unbreakable, about the night she finally struck back, sending her tormentor to the bottom of the Mississippi, about the dangerous escape north and the friends lost along the way. When she finished, silence hung heavy over the gathering. Then, one by one, others shared their stories, each testimony a thread in the larger tapestry of resistance, survival, and liberation. As the fire died low and folks began heading to their cabins, Margaret walked alone to the river's edge one final time. She knelt at the water, touched its surface gently, and spoke to it like an old friend. "Thank you," she whispered, "for holding me all those times, for teaching me strength, for taking him when justice demanded, for bringing me here to this moment, to this freedom." The water rippled in response, and Margaret swore she heard Yamoja's voice one last time. "You honored our pact, daughter. You survived. You testified. You helped others find freedom. Your work is sacred. Your story is eternal." Margaret stood feeling lighter than she had in years. She'd never find her lost children. That wound would never fully heal. She'd never forget the horrors of bondage. Those scars ran too deep. But she'd transformed suffering into purpose, pain into power, victimhood into resistance. She'd become living testimony that the enslaved were not passive victims but active resistors, that women had power even in the most powerless circumstances, that the river could be both torment and salvation, that 700 drownings could forge a spirit unbreakable as iron. As she walked back to her cabin, Margaret thought about all the souls still in bondage, still suffering under evil masters, still dreaming of freedom. Her story would reach them somehow, whispered in quarters, coded in spirituals, passed along the Underground Railroad, and maybe, just maybe, it would give them the courage to resist, to run, to fight for their own liberation. The Mississippi River still flowed in the south, carrying Thorpe's bones somewhere in its depths, holding the memory of 700 drownings and one perfect act of justice. The water never forgot. The ancestors never forgot. And as long as even one person remembered Margaret's story, she'd never be forgotten either. She stood at her cabin door, looked up at the North Star that had guided her to freedom, and spoke one final prayer of gratitude. Then she went inside, free and unbroken, ready to rise tomorrow and continue the sacred work of liberation. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory behind like footprints in sacred ground. The whip fell silent. The auction block crumbled to dust. But the stories, the testimonies of those who refused to be broken, those live on, carried in the voices of descendants, sung in spirituals, whispered in the wind that blows through old plantation grounds. Margaret Duafagamento, the mother who survived 600 forced dives and drowned the rapist in the Mississippi, became more than one woman's story. She became symbol and song, warning and promise, proof that resistance was possible even in the deepest darkness. The river still flows, the ancestors still watch, and somewhere in the currents of memory, Margaret's voice still speaks, telling all who will listen, survive, resist, testify, be unbreakable. Her story echoes still, reverberating through generations, a sacred testimony preserved in the mud echoes from the quarters, where the past speaks to the present, where suffering transforms into strength, where the voices of the enslaved refuse to be silenced even by death itself. Remember her. Remember them all. For in remembering we honor. In honoring, we heal. In healing, we rise.